What if they never died? What if the execution of Jacques de Molay was never the end, but a beginning? What if the fire that burned him alive was meant to erase something far more dangerous than heresy? Something alive, something organized, something enduring? What if the Knights Templar did not vanish, but evolved? They disappeared from the public eye. Yes, but their symbols reappeared. Their rituals echoed through new halls, and their power. Well, some say it grew stronger in the shadows. And centuries later, another secret society emerged. One just as enigmatic, just as widespread. The Freemasons. Coincidence or continuity? Let's slow things down. You're not here for flashing swords or blaring horns. You're here for something quieter, stranger, a whisper threaded through the centuries. The kind of mystery that lingers in old stone and candle smoke. So close your eyes, breathe deep, and follow the symbols. It's time to descend into memory. It begins as it often does in the dark. The date is October 13th, 1307, a Friday. Dawn has not yet broken over Paris when armored hooves echo down the alleys. Templar knights, once hailed as holy warriors of Christendom, are dragged from their beds. Shackled, beaten, accused, we are innocent. The charges are almost absurd in their variety. Heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, sodomy, even spitting on the cross. Confessions are extracted beneath red-hot iron, and waterboards soaked in centuries of holy war. The King Philip I of France declares them guilty. The Pope, caught in political quicksand, disbands the order. And then fire, public burnings, smoldering robes, screams that twist into legend. But here's the problem. Not all Templars were captured. Not all ships were found. Not all gold was accounted for, and not all knowledge was lost. What followed was a strange silence. You'd think the sudden collapse of one of Europe's most powerful military and financial networks would leave more noise in its wake. But instead, a hush fell across the continent, broken only by scattered rumors. Some claimed to see Templar knights in Portugal riding under a different banner. Others whispered of strange rituals in the catacombs beneath Scotland. Entire fleets allegedly vanished into the Atlantic, sailing towards secrets beyond the map's edge. And somewhere along the timeline, quietly, elegantly, another secret society began to rise. They wore aprons instead of armor. Their weapons were symbols: compass, square, trowel. Their battles were fought in silence, their victories carved into architecture, and their obsession with ancient knowledge, sacred geometry, and the Temple of Solomon unmistakable. The Freemasons became many things: builders, revolutionaries, philosophers. But the question has never gone away. Who taught them? Because as we trace the rituals, the symbols, the language, something strange begins to emerge, a shadow, a continuity. What if the Freemasons didn't create something new? What if they inherited something very old tonight? You'll follow a thread that stretches from burning stakes in Paris to secret rooms beneath Washington, D.C. You'll hear the clash of swords beneath Masonic oaths. You'll feel the rhythm of rituals passed hand to hand, century to century. You'll meet a brotherhood that may never have died, only changed its face. And through it all, you'll be safe here in the quiet dark where the symbols glow faintly and history whispers its forbidden tales. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Now breathe slowly. We're going back to the night the fires were lit, and we're not coming back the same. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, while the sky was still dark and dew still clung to the rooftops of Paris, a quiet thunder rolled through the city. It wasn't a storm, though one was coming. It was the sound of hooves, armor, and the whispered orders of royal guards executing one of the most coordinated betrayals in European history. By nightfall, over 600 members of the Knights Templar had been arrested. Not slain in battle, not defeated in some final crusade, but seized in their beds like common criminals. Some were dragged from monasteries. Others were pulled from prayer. All were accused of crimes that struck at the very soul of Christendom. The charges were as grotesque as they were bewildering: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, sodomy, secret rites, kissing of base body parts, the worship of a mysterious idol called Baphomet. The public was shocked, but it wasn't just the severity of the accusations that stunned the continent. It was their suddenness. The Templars had long been heroes of the cross. They had fought in the Holy Land, protected pilgrims, established fortresses from Jerusalem to Acre. They had acted as bankers, diplomats, and emissaries. They answered to no king, only the Pope. And now the Pope, under pressure from King Philip IV of France, was silent, complicit, terrified. Philip's motives were hardly spiritual. He was deeply in debt to the order. The Templars had financed his wars, supported his rivalries, and now stood as a financial threat, not just a religious one. But where the sword of war failed, the poison of rumor succeeded. Torture brought confessions screamed under duress, extracted with fire and fear. And those confessions were used to justify the dissolution of one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. But this is where the official story ends and the mystery begins. Because not all Templars were arrested. Not all commanderies were breached. And most importantly of all, not a single coin of their legendary treasure was found. You see, the Templars weren't just knights. They were networkers. They had established an intricate web of properties, ships, and safe houses across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their communications were encrypted, their vaults hidden, their loyalty absolute. They were a shadow organization long before they became fugitives. And when the king moved, they did what all good systems do under threat. They scattered, protected their assets, and vanished into silence. Take the city of La Rochelle. It was the Templars' primary naval port in France, a bustling harbor with docks deep enough for their heavy cargo ships. Just days before the arrests began, several large ships disappeared from its harbors. There were no battle reports, no wreckage, no survivors. Only rumors of a fleet that had set sail under cover of darkness, laden with gold relics and men who would never be seen again. Some believe they sailed west toward Scotland or even the New World. Others suggest they vanished into the southern seas bound for Portugal. Then there are the commanderies themselves. When inquisitors arrived to seize properties and catalog inventory, they found nothing. Empty rooms, cooled hearths, barracks without armor, chapels without books, no signs of a struggle, no hidden corpses, no confession notes left behind. It was as if the men had packed up and walked into the earth. And in many cases, that may not be far from the truth. Templar properties often included underground vaults, catacombs, and escape tunnels. The question is, were they designed for defense or for disappearance? Some historians argue that the order had advanced warning, that sympathetic nobles or even informants within the church leaked the king's intentions. Whether that's true or not, the speed and precision of the Templar withdrawal suggest one thing above all. This was not a collapse. It was a controlled retreat. In countries beyond France, the order's fate played out very differently. In England, the arrests came months later and lacked the same brutal coordination. Many Templars were released after questioning. In Aragon and Hungary, most were acquitted or simply absorbed into other monastic orders. In Germany, trials dragged on with few clear outcomes. But it was in Portugal that the Templars underwent their most dramatic transformation. There under King Denis the Furin, they were not persecuted but protected. In 1319 the king created the Order of Christ, granting it Templar lands, Templar leadership, and according to some Templar traditions. It was the same structure, the same system under a different name. And here lies the crux of it. If the Templars could survive as a renamed order in one country, what stopped them from doing so elsewhere? Not as warriors, but as something else, something quieter, more secretive, more adaptable. Some point to Switzerland, a country that at the time was emerging from feudal fragmentation into structured neutrality. The Swiss banking system, its emphasis on secrecy and protection of assets, bears uncanny resemblance to the Templar model. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe the Templars simply moved their operations, their archives, and their loyalties into a new mountain refuge. But perhaps the strangest detail lies not in where they went, but in what survived. The rituals, the symbols, the architecture. Decades after the order's dissolution, new organizations began to appear across Europe. Small fraternities of builders, thinkers, and mystics. They wore aprons instead of armor. They spoke in code, met in silence, and obsessed over symbols drawn from Solomon's temple, sacred geometry, and moral enlightenment. They called themselves Freemasons. And while the historical record claims no formal connection, the overlaps are difficult to ignore. Templar initiation rites involved secrecy, sacred oaths, symbolic death, and rebirth. Freemasonry echoes these precisely. Templar records speak of two central pillars, Jachin and Boaz, standing at the threshold of divine knowledge. Freemasons placed these same pillars at the entrance of every symbolic lodge. The Templars revered the number 3, the triangle, the temple itself. So do the Masons. Could these be coincidences, echoes from the past? Or are they deliberate inheritances, fragments of a tradition kept alive in silence? One thing is certain. The flame that burned Jacques de Molay did not destroy the order. It transformed it, not in the public square, but in basement, cathedrals, and hidden rooms, where where secrets were safer than swords, and the Brotherhood, whatever name it now wore, lived on in darkness and in design. They say the best place to hide a secret is in plain sight. But to do that, you must first become invisible. Not by vanishing into the wilderness, but by blending into the crowd, changing your name, your language, your uniform. You must become the kind of ghost that no one thinks to chase. And if the Templars truly survived the purges of 1307 and beyond, then that is exactly what they did. In the years immediately following the disbanding of the order, we find signs, whispers really, that not all Templars were broken, not all were burned. Some melted quietly into monastic life. Others fled east, disappearing into the mountains of Armenia or the deserts of Cyprus. A few we know found refuge under sympathetic rulers like Denis of Portugal. But there were others who took a different path, a quieter one, a path not of exile but of adaptation. It began with symbols. In buildings long assumed to be ordinary churches or civic halls, certain carvings began to appear, 2 pillars, always 2 standing side by side, usually marked with strange initials J and B. In other places, a 5-pointed star carved into doorframes or etched above arches, the all-seeing eye, the square and compass. These were not the designs of masons hired for aesthetics. They were coded language signs meant for those who knew how to read them. But the most haunting thing about these marks was not their symbolism. It was their timing. They began appearing in significant numbers in the mid to late 1300s, just decades after the supposed end of the Templar order. Coincidence or continuity? One of the most mysterious examples of this symbolic bleed lies in Scotland. At the time of the Templar suppression, Scotland was excommunicated by the Pope, placing it politically and spiritually beyond Rome's control. It was a perfect refuge. And in the green hills south of Edinburgh, a peculiar building still stands, Rosslyn Chapel. Completed in 1486 by Sir William Sinclair, whose family had long-standing ties to both the Crusades and to the Knights Templar. The chapel is a stunning example of Gothic architecture. But it is also something else, a silent manuscript carved in stone. Inside Rosslyn, the columns twist in spirals. The ceiling is filled with stars, angels, vines, and keys. But look closely, and something stranger emerges. Motifs that do not belong in Christian iconography. Templar crosses. The apprentice pillar linked to esoteric legends, and most mysteriously, carvings of what appear to be maize and American crop half a century before Columbus ever sailed west. The suggestion that not only did Templar knowledge survive in Scotland, but that it possibly included pre-Columbian contact with the New World. That notion remains speculative, but the symbolism within Rosslyn is not. Its Masonic and Templar themes are undeniable. In nearby records, we find that Scottish lodges, meeting places for operative stonemasons, began adopting rituals of initiation, secret signs, and degrees of hierarchy as early as the late 1300s. This was long before the formal creation of speculative Freemasonry in the 1600s. Why would stone workers need rites of secrecy and layers of symbolic meaning unless someone else, someone outside the trade, had passed those traditions to them? Nowhere is this potential transmission more tantalizing than in the so-called Charter of Larmanius, a Latin manuscript discovered in the 1700s, but allegedly written in 1324. It claims to record a secret continuation of the Templar order through an unbroken line of Grand Masters, beginning with Jean-Marc Laminius, who was supposedly appointed by Demol himself. Many scholars call the document a forgery. Others point to its archaic phrasing, consistent Latin structure, and historical names as evidence of legitimacy. Whether the charter is authentic or not, it tells us something crucial. The idea of Templar survival never truly died. It lived in the minds of knights, monks, mystics, and perhaps somewhere deeper, those who were keeping the flame alive. But this transformation wouldn't have been immediate. No one goes from warrior monk to esoteric philosopher overnight. The shift had to be gradual, organic, like a river changing course. First, the weapons were laid down. The sword became a symbol, not a tool. The shield gave way to the apron. Then the focus shifted from protecting pilgrims to building inner temples, from defending Jerusalem to decoding Solomon's architecture, and from literal warfare to spiritual enlightenment. The first known reference to a Masonic lodge occurs in 1390 in the Regius manuscript, a poem written in Middle English that describes the moral and technical rules of stonemasons. Though largely practical, it contains strange flourishes, invocations of the 7 liberal arts, references to Noah and Solomon, and an emphasis on secrecy. Why would Masons who built bridges and cathedrals need secrecy, unless secrecy was the point? Unless they had inherited more than just architectural knowledge. This slow convergence between the remnants of a persecuted religious order and the burgeoning tradition of sacred builders created fertile ground for something new to take root. A fusion of moral philosophy, sacred geometry, ritual theater, and ancient symbolism. A system built to hide in plain sight. By the 1500s, these lodges were no longer merely groups of tradesmen. They had initiates. They had ceremonies. They had degrees. And increasingly, they had members who were not builders at all, but thinkers, philosophers, alchemists, astronomers, and even nobles. By 1599, the Lodge of Edinburgh had formal minutes. By 1646, the antiquarian Elias Ashall recorded his own initiation into a Masonic lodge, making him one of the first known speculative Freemasons. And in 1717, the Grand Lodge of London was officially formed, formalizing what was already centuries in the making. But the question remains, how much of what Freemasonry became was built upon Templar bones? How many rituals were borrowed? How many secrets repackaged? And how many brothers in darkened lodges whispered words that had once echoed in Jerusalem, Acre, and La Rochelle? Even today, some Masonic lodges explicitly include the Templar order as a degree within their ranks. Knights Templar regalia is worn, oaths are taken, and the myth, if it is one, lives on. So if you are looking for the Templars, don't search only in the ashes of 1314. Look instead to the lodges built centuries later, to the twin pillars that still stand, to the square and compass etched above doorways, to the candles burning in windowless rooms. They never vanished. They adapted. They hid not in caves or forests, but in rituals, in brotherhood, in plain sight. And perhaps if you listen closely enough, you can still hear their quiet step echo beneath the creaking floorboards of a Masonic lodge. If the Templars truly escaped their own destruction, if they fled the prisons and flames of France, then they must have fled somewhere. Somewhere far enough to be safe, yet close enough to regroup, somewhere beyond the Pope's direct control, somewhere they could sail to quickly and well-built ships loaded with men, gold, and secrets too dangerous to burn. For many historians and seekers of lost orders, that somewhere has long been believed to be Portugal. It's easy to forget in the grand sweep of history that Portugal was once a Templar stronghold. The order had been deeply entrenched there since the 12th century, fighting alongside Portuguese kings to reclaim land from the Moors. In return for their valor, the Templars were richly rewarded castles, estates, entire towns. They built massive fortifications, established supply lines, and helped carve out the very borders of the fledgling nation. By the early 1300s, the Templars weren't just guests in Portugal. They were part of the national fabric. Then came the Purge. As the Templar order was being dismantled across France, and Pope Clement V's edicts spread across Europe, each nation was faced with a choice. Enforce the will of the Church, or find a clever way to keep the Templars alive without drawing Rome's eye. King Denis I of Portugal chose the latter. He was no fool. He knew the value of the Templars not only as warriors but as administrators, engineers, and financial minds. So in 1319, just 5 years after the execution of Jacques de Molay, King Denis petitioned the Pope to establish a new religious military order under his protection. This new group would be called the Order of Christ. It would take over all the properties formerly held by the Templars. It would have new insignia, new rules, and on paper no connection to the disgraced order. But beneath the surface, very little changed. The men were the same. Many Templars were simply reordained into the new brotherhood. Their lands remained intact. Their hierarchies survived. Even their headquarters, like the great fortress at Tamar, remained in use. It was a rebranding, not a resurrection. Tamar itself stands as a monument to this transformation. Nestled in central Portugal, the Convent of Christ sits atop a hill. Its round Templar church rising like a stone flower. Its octagonal design echoes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a sacred geometry inherited from the earliest Crusader architecture. Within its walls are carvings of ships, stars, and esoteric motifs, some Christian, some oddly pagan. But most notable of all are the cross-shaped windows and doorways, some of which resemble the classic Red Templar cross, and others that mirror later Masonic stylizations. From Tomar, the newly minted Order of Christ continued to build and administer, quietly preserving Templar knowledge under a different name. They would go on to play a pivotal role in one of Portugal's greatest achievements, the Age of Exploration. This too is no coincidence. Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the masterminds behind Portugal's maritime expansion, was not only a royal prince, but also the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his leadership, Portuguese fleets began to explore the African coast, establish trade posts, and eventually cross oceans. The red cross on their sails, that was the cross of the Order of Christ, a descendant of the Templar emblem. So now we ask, what knowledge exactly were those ships carrying? The standard historical answer is maps, navigational instruments, and royal mandates. But there are whispers, quiet, persistent whispers that suggest something deeper. That Prince Henry's navigators had access to older charts. That the Order of Christ possessed hidden knowledge passed down from Templar mariners who had fled France. That these new discoveries were in some cases rediscoveries. The idea of Templar voyages, perhaps even to the Americas before Columbus, is dismissed by most mainstream historians. But in the corners of old libraries, strange things emerge. One such artifact is the Zeno map created in the 1550s, but allegedly copied from a much older chart that described lands west of Iceland long before official European contact. Another is the Piri Reis map created by an Ottoman admiral in 1513, which shows parts of the New World and even Antarctica's coast long before those regions were discovered. Some researchers believe these maps reflect preserved in Templar vaults, transmitted through the Order of Christ, and passed on to explorers under their protection. If true, then Portugal was more than a refuge. It was a launch pad for a secret legacy. And then there are the ships themselves. The Templars had maintained a small but sophisticated fleet in La Rochelle. When the arrests began in France, those ships vanished. No wreckage, no records, just silence. If they sailed south down the Atlantic coast, Portugal would have been their most logical destination. Its ports were friendly. Its king was sympathetic. Its coastline was dotted with Templar outposts. Imagine then a moonlit night in 1307. A fleet gliding into a Portuguese harbor. Templars disembarking beneath hooded cloaks, boxes unloaded, scrolls locked in iron chests, and somewhere perhaps in Tomar, perhaps deeper inland, a vault opening to receive them. If this happened, the implications are staggering. It would mean that a major portion of the Templar network not only survived the purge, but continued to evolve, preserved under royal protection, hidden from inquisitors, and repurposed for a new mission, exploration, expansion, and the silent transmission of ancient knowledge. And while the Order of Christ would later be secularized, its legacy endures. Its cross still adorns Portuguese flags. Its symbols still mark old maps. And its influence perhaps lives on in the quiet rituals of other brotherhoods that trace their roots to the builders of temples and ships alike. So if the Templars did survive, and if they did hide not in ruins or forests, but in the open arms of a nation, they did so here in Portugal, in its fortresses, in its sails, and in its silence. Because survival is not always about going underground. Sometimes it's about becoming something new, and making the world forget you were ever something else. If the Templars were searching for a place to vanish, to lay low, to rebuild, far from the reach of papal justice, Portugal was only the first of two key sanctuaries. The other was even more mysterious, less obvious. A nation on the very edge of Europe, windswept, war-torn, and excommunicated. A land ruled not by Rome, but by rebellion. That land was Scotland. To understand why Scotland mattered, we have to look at timing. In 1307, the same year the Templar arrests began in France, Scotland was in the middle of a brutal war of independence against England. King Edward the Thirst, the so-called Hammer of the Scots, had invaded, executed William Wallace, and forced the Scottish nobility into submission. But a new leader was rising, Robert the Bruce. In 1306, he had declared himself King of Scots without the Pope's blessing. In retaliation, Pope Clement Thram excommunicated him and placed Scotland under interdict, no sacraments, no clerical authority, no interference from Rome. In other words, a perfect hiding place. If the Templars were looking for a land outside the Pope's reach, where they might regroup, Scotland was ideal. Not only was it politically isolated, it also had a tradition of hospitality toward crusaders. Many Scottish nobles had taken the cross in earlier generations. Some had even fought alongside the Templars in the Holy Land. That legacy mattered. It created ties personal, ancestral, and spiritual. And then there's the curious story of the Battle of Bannockburn. The battle took place in June 1314, just 3 months after Jacques de Mol's execution in France. Robert the Bruce's forces were vastly outnumbered by the English army. According to official history, the Scots won through clever tactics, terrain advantage, and sheer determination. But there's a legend rarely mentioned in textbooks that a mysterious force appeared on the battlefield. A group of armored horsemen cloaked and silent charged into the fray at a decisive moment. Their banner bore no clear insignia. Their origin was unknown, but their arrival turned the tide. Some chroniclers claimed they were Knights Hospiter. Others thought them to be a last-minute contingent from the Highlands. But a few, very few, whispered something stranger, that they were Templars. It's a romantic notion easily dismissed. There is no hard evidence to confirm it. But consider the timing. Templars fleeing persecution in France may well have landed in Scotland by 1313. And if they did, Bannockburn would have offered a chance not just for redemption, but for rebirth. Because after the battle, something changed in Scotland. While the Templar Order remained officially outlawed across Europe and Scotland, there was no inquisition, no arrests, no trials. And within a few short decades, something else began to take shape. Secret brotherhoods of builders and stonemasons meeting in lodges bound by oaths of secrecy and surrounded by symbols that bore striking resemblance to the Templar tradition. And in the heart of this strange symbolic world stands a single building, a chapel carved in stone filled with riddles and unlike any other in Europe. Rosslyn Chapel was commissioned in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney. His family traced its roots to Norman nobility, like the Templars, and had long-standing connections to both Crusader expeditions and Scottish Freemasonry. But what makes Rosslyn so extraordinary is not its history. It's the architecture. Inside Rosslyn, the walls are alive with carvings, angels playing bagpipes, green men sprouting vines, geometric patterns echoing Pythagorean theorems, and curiously two massive stone pillars, one called the Master Pillar, the other the Apprentice Pillar. Between them runs a symbolic path, and above them arches a ceiling of stars. But perhaps the most tantalizing symbol found within the chapel is the Templar cross embedded in multiple places, often near carvings of knights and ships. The chapel's crypt, sealed for centuries, has long been rumored to contain relics, perhaps even the lost treasure of the Templars themselves. There is no proof, only whispers. And then there is the maze. Above one column, there are carvings of what appears to be corn maize, a crop native to the Americas. The chapel was completed decades before Columbus sailed west. How could this be? Some theorists claim it's proof of pre-Columbian contact. That Sinclair or the Templars before him sailed to the New World and returned with secrets. It's an extraordinary claim, heavily disputed. But the corn is there carved in stone, staring silently through time. Even if one dismisses the American connection, Rosslyn remains a shrine to something hidden, something sacred, a fusion of Christian mysticism, esoteric geometry, and unmistakably Templar legacy. And it was built not by Crusaders, but by Masons, which brings us to the Scottish lodges. By the 1300s, Scotland was home to numerous guilds of operative stonemasons. These were working men, builders of castles, cathedrals, and cloisters. But over time, their lodges took on a different character. They began adopting rituals, symbols, and spiritual allegories. By the 1500s, these lodges were admitting non-Masons men of philosophy, nobility, and science. This was the birth of speculative Freemasonry. And at the center of this tradition stood the idea of the temple, not just the physical one in Jerusalem, but a symbolic temple of the soul to be built through moral virtue and esoteric understanding. Sound familiar? The tools of the Mason, the square, the compass, the plumb were transformed into symbols of ethical life. The process of building became a metaphor for inner enlightenment and the journey from apprentice to master. It mirrored the Templar path of devotion, initiation, and guardianship of sacred truths. Even the rituals of initiation, cloaked in allegory and secrecy, bear echoes of Templar rites, oaths sworn under penalty of death. The dramatic reenactment of death and rebirth, the passing of secret words and signs. It would be easy to dismiss this as coincidence. But then there's the fact that in modern Freemasonry, the Knights Templar are not just a historical curiosity. They are a degree, an active, honored part of the York Rite, and in some regions an entire branch of membership. Freemasons today don ceremonial armor, bear Templar swords, and swear oaths under the banner of the cross patty. So the question remains, is this merely romantic symbolism, or is it a memory dimmed by centuries preserved in ritual passed hand-o-hand like a torch that never quite went out? Scotland gave the Templars something no other nation could in their hour of need, sanctuary without scrutiny. And in return, the Templars may have given Scotland something enduring, a blueprint for a brotherhood that would one day reach around the world, whispered, symbolic, and hidden in plain sight. There are patterns we are taught to overlook, marks in stone that seem decorative, shapes on ancient walls dismissed as coincidence. But symbols, true symbols, are rarely random. They are chosen, preserved, and often they are passed down quietly, hand to hand, generation to generation, long after the memory of why has faded. So what happens when we start seeing those symbols appear where they shouldn't? Across Europe, from Portugal to Scotland to Bohemia, there are curious recurrences, identical shapes carved in stone or inked onto parchment, that seem to span centuries and continents, not religious iconography, not royal coats of arms, something old or stranger. Among them are the twin pillars marked J and B, squares and compasses locked in unnatural angles, blazing stars and all-seeing eyes. These are not the accidental scratches of masons. They are deliberate and they are consistent. Take the twin pillars, for example. They appear on cathedrals, castles, and ceremonial arches built centuries apart and thousands of miles away. In the Bible, Jachin and Boaz stood at the entrance of Solomon's temple pillars of initiation and divine balance. But why would a cathedral in 14th century Prague include these on its gate? Why would they be echoed almost exactly in a lodge hall in 18th century Edinburgh? And why, perhaps most curiously, do they appear in buildings connected to the same noble families who once supported the Templars? These patterns are not limited to architecture. In old manuscripts, marginalia scribbled by unknown hands, we find the square and compass drawn beside prayers, astrological charts, or theological treatises, always hidden, always subtle, as though the scribe wanted the symbol to be seen, but only by the right eyes. One such manuscript was found in a Bavarian monastery dated 1457. Tucked in the margins of a hymnal was a small diagram, a compass inside a square with a 7-pointed star above it. No explanation, no commentary, just the mark. Scholars ignored it for years, assuming it was decorative. But when compared to early Masonic tracing boards diagrams used in lodge rituals, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. Then there's the cross. Not the Latin cross of Christendom, but the equal-armed red cross, the cross patty used by the Templars. This shape, thought to have vanished after the order's suppression, begins reappearing in the 15th and 16th centuries in peculiar places carved into hearthstone, inked into family crests, even worked into the stitching of ceremonial garments, and in at least one case found on a gravestone in southern France. The cross is surrounded by symbols that do not appear anywhere else in Christian tradition. A sun with an eye in its center, a serpent biting its own tail, and a triangle with rays. Some of these images, like the serpent, appear in Hermetic and alchemical texts. Others, like the eye and the sun, are now known worldwide as the Eye of Providence. But its earliest uses in this form predate the Enlightenment. Long before the United States adopted it for their Great Seal, long before the Age of Reason, it shows up once again in connection with mysterious stone lodges in Scotland, Portugal, and the Swiss Alps. We must ask, why do all these signs converge around the same time? The 14th through 17th centuries saw a rapid spread of what we now call Freemasonry. But if you follow the trail backwards, you find these symbols already present in the shadows before lodges were public. Before Masonic texts were printed, before speculative masonry had a name. These were the signs of something moving underground. Not dead, just hidden. One of the most striking examples comes from Italy. In Bologna, a sealed room was discovered beneath a medieval merchant house during renovations in 1972. Inside was a simple chair, a table, and on the walls, scratched into the plaster, were dozens of symbols. Many were mathematical spirals, triangles, perfect circles. But interwoven were unmistakable Masonic glyphs, a compass, a templating placed the room's last use in the late 1400s. What was this space? A meeting room, a sanctuary, or something older, a transitional chamber between the last Templars and the first Freemasons. To those who view the past as linear, these findings are inconvenient. They challenge the neat categories of before and after, of collapse and rebirth. But symbols are not linear. They're recursive. They loop through time, resurfacing when the moment is right. And there are those who would say this isn't just a pattern, it's a code. One theory long whispered in the corners of historical esoterica is that the Templars encoded their knowledge in symbols precisely because they knew words could be destroyed. Parchment could burn. Testimonies could be tortured out of men, but symbols endure. You carve them in stone. You pass them into architecture. You let them ride the shoulders of cathedrals and the capitals of columns. You let them be mistaken for decoration. And then when the world forgets, Someone remembers that someone may have been the early Freemasons. When you look at the earliest Masonic tracing boards, the visual maps of lodge rituals, you find a strange blend of biblical allegory, geometric precision, and unmistakable Templar influence. Solomon's Temple is central, yes, but so is the idea of a hidden chamber, a lost word, a sacred geometry that can unlock divine wisdom. These are not new ideas. They are inherited ones. And perhaps that's the greatest symbol of all, that the Templar legacy, whatever it truly was never buried in one place. It was fractured, dispersed, encrypted across time. Not a treasure in a chest, not a vault in a chapel, but a language of signs scattered across continents. Left not for archaeologists, but for initiates, for those who know where to look and what to look for. Because some truths are not hidden by design. They're hidden by repetition. And when a symbol becomes common enough, no one thinks to question it. That's when it's safest and most powerful. They built in silence. No manifestos, no declarations, no signatures carved into the stones they placed. No fanfare announcing what they had done. But if you look closely, the fingerprints are there, hidden in the angles, the alignments, the quiet geometry humming beneath centuries of mortar and marble. These were not merely masons in the literal sense. These were architects of meaning, engineers of memory, and the blueprints they followed were as much spiritual as they were structural. In the centuries following the dissolution of the Templars, a curious architectural phenomenon emerged across Europe. The construction of chapels, civic buildings, and monuments that bore no clear function beyond the symbolic structures rich in allegory, saturated in geometry, and curiously divorced from the traditional iconography of the Church. These were not grand cathedrals proclaiming the majesty of God. They were smaller structures designed not to preach, but to conceal. In France, one such structure stands near Rennes-Lateau. The Magdala Tower built on ancient foundations. Its circular form, spiral staircase, and unusual cardinal alignment suggest more than aesthetic flair. It whispers of something encoded, something left behind by those who understood that meaning could be preserved not in texts but in shapes. In Germany, the Rossdorf Chapel presents another enigma. Built in the early 1500s by stonemasons working without known patronage, the building contains no pews, no altar, no baptismal font. Instead, its interior is dominated by strange proportions and a domed ceiling covered in star maps. Maps that curiously align with the sky not at the time of its construction, but with the night sky of Jerusalem on a date lost to official records. And in Portugal at the Convent of Christ in Tamar, additions made long after the Templars were gone feature spiral staircases that lead to nowhere loves that echo sound in unnatural ways and corridors that align perfectly with solstice light. These are not accidents of design. They are messages in architecture. And behind them always are the hands of men who claim to be builders, but were in truth something more. These silent architects were not just creating buildings. They were constructing vessels, temples of encoded knowledge, places where geometry became scripture and proportion became prayer. Their tools, the square, the compass, the plumb line, were not only instruments of precision, but instruments of initiation. To measure a perfect angle was in their world an act of devotion. Some scholars trace the rise of this sacred architecture to the collegia of ancient Rome guilds of builders and artisans who carried forward traditions from Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. But something happened in the centuries following the Templar downfall. The traditions shifted. They became more secretive, more symbolic. The lodges of working masons once focused on stone and timber began to speak in allegories. Their tools became metaphors, and their buildings began to reflect a kind of mystical logic that had little to do with conventional religion. This evolution is visible in the design of Masonic tracing boards, artistic renderings used to teach initiates the secrets of their craft. These boards, many of which date to the 1600s and earlier, depict columns labeled Jachin and Boaz, staircases leading to blazing stars, checkerboard floors, suns, moons, and veiled altars. Every element has meaning, and taken together they form a visual theology, a language meant to be read not with the eyes but with the soul. What's strange is how many of these elements echo earlier Templar symbolism. The Temple of Solomon, central to Masonic thought, was also sacred to the Templars, whose very name derived from their headquarters built on its ancient foundations in Jerusalem. The Red Cross, once a symbol of knightly service, reappears in Masonic orders with military flair. Even the phrase Freemason, at first meaning a Mason free to travel, gains new meaning when paired with the Templar tradition of men freed from feudal allegiance bound instead by sacred vow. One of the most compelling links between architecture symbolism and the Templar legacy is found in the layout of certain cities. Edinburgh, for example, has been noted for its unusual alignment of key buildings, some suggestive of Masonic tracing boards. Washington, D.C., designed by Pierre Charles Lawn. A known Freemason, is famous for its symbolic layout, streets forming pentagrams, buildings aligned to solstices, and the Capitol dome crowned by a figure not of Christ, but of liberty, an Enlightenment goddess rooted in Roman and Hermetic lore. Is this a coincidence of Enlightenment architecture? Or is it the continuation of something older? A tradition passed down through silent brotherhoods, from Templars to Masons, from sacred architects to city planners. Consider the words of the 18th century architect and Freemason James Anderson, whose constitutions of the Freemasons declared that ancient kings, priests, and philosophers all studied architecture as the noblest of sciences. He described the Masonic Lodge not merely as a place of meeting, but as a symbolic reconstruction of Solomon's Temple, a spiritual space for the recreation of sacred order in the chaos of the world. To build then was to remember, to measure was to awaken, and to carve in stone was to whisper across time. This reverence for the symbolic structure is why so many early Freemasons were drawn from the educated elite philosophers, scientists, and yes, architects. They weren't just designing bridges and palaces. They were seeking to embody divine order through form, proportion, and alignment. Many believed that to construct a truly sacred building was to echo the structure of the cosmos itself. The most enigmatic expression of this belief is found not in Europe, but in the Americas. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as Freemasonry flourished in the New World, a new generation of architects emerged, men like Benjamin Latro, William Buckland, and Thomas Jefferson, who filled civic buildings with obelisks, domes, and hidden ratios. These were not simply expressions of neoclassical style. They were declarations of symbolic allegiance. Temples to reason, yes, but also temples to memory. The memory of a hidden order, a scattered brotherhood, an architecture of silence. So the next time you walk through an old city, pause, look up, count the steps, trace the light, ask why a window faces the east, or why a column has no apparent purpose. Ask what it was meant to show and to whom. Because not every building is what it seems. Some are maps, some are mirrors, and some are messages written in angles, spoken in silence, remembered not in books, but in stone. If the Templars truly survived not just as scattered men, but as an idea, then they needed more than symbols carved into stone. They needed language, a new kind of language, not Latin or French, but something deeper. A system built to protect what they knew and who they were. A code not just for secrecy, but for survival. And that's where the Masons come in. For centuries, the Freemasons have been surrounded by an aura of mystery. Their rituals, their hierarchies, their private gatherings in windowless lodges. These details have fascinated and unnerved outsiders since the first Grand Lodges were established in the early 18th century. But the roots of that secrecy go much further back. In fact, they go so far back that historians still debate where the border lies between fact and mythology. The Masonic Code, the body of passwords, gestures, symbols, and allegories used within the lodge, was never meant for public consumption. It wasn't designed to impress or explain. It was designed to exclude, to protect, and above all to transmit something that words alone could not carry. One of the earliest known Masonic manuscripts is the Regius poem, dated to the late 14th century. It's a curious document, a moral treatise disguised as a poem filled with allegories and rules for behavior. On the surface, it reads like a code of conduct for stoneworkers. But look again, and it becomes something else. A roadmap of initiation, a guide for spiritual construction, a glimpse into an encoded worldview. It begins here, begin the constitutions of the art of geometry, according to Euclid. And from there it blends lessons in morality with strange references to ancient figures, Solomon, Nimrod, even the Greeks. Why would a 14th century British manuscript about building refer to Nimrod? Why would it speak of hidden knowledge passed down through ages, unless it was drawing from a far older source? Some researchers believe the Regius and other early Masonic texts are remnants of a much older oral tradition, one that originated with the Templars, who themselves had drawn upon a tapestry of influences: Jewish mysticism, Christian Gnosticism, Islamic science, and perhaps even Egyptian and Greek esoterica. This is where the idea of the Masonic Code becomes more than ritual. It becomes a vessel for survival. Imagine for a moment that you are a fugitive Templar in the early 1300s. You can't write down what you know. You can't speak your truth openly, but you can build a system. a system that encodes meaning and architecture in initiation rites in carefully chosen symbols. You teach it not through scripture, but through ceremony. And you pass it down not to everyone, but only to those deemed worthy. What results is a lineage of thought disguised as tradition, a structure of ideas hidden behind a structure of fraternity. The form is simple apprentices, fellows, masters, but the content it is layered with references to the Temple of Solomon, the loss of sacred knowledge, the search for a lost word, all echoing the themes that once defined the Templar worldview. Even today, the most sacred moment in a Masonic ritual is the reenactment of the loss of that word, the divine name, the key to enlightenment lost in the mists of history. The initiate plays the role of one seeking truth. He is brought before symbolic death, and only through perseverance, humility, and courage can he be raised again, symbolically reborn into a brotherhood of builders. This mirrors in uncanny ways the initiation rites described in Templar confessions, many of which were obtained under torture, yes, but which consistently mentioned acts of symbolic death and rebirth. Oaths of secrecy and secret knowledge revealed only to the initiated. One of the most provocative elements of the Masonic Code is its use of geometry, not just practical geometry, but sacred geometry. The belief that shapes and ratios carry divine significance. The compass and square are not just tools. They are metaphysical symbols. The triangle represents harmony. The pentagram balance, the golden ratio, divine perfection. These were the same ideas studied in medieval monasteries guarded by esoteric thinkers, and according to some passed from the Templars into Masonic hands. The code also lives in gestures. A handshake is never just a handshake in the lodge. It's a cipher. Each degree has its own grip, its own password, its own way of ensuring that knowledge is passed only to those who've earned it. This isn't mere theater. It's a safeguard, a relic from a time when secrets could cost lives. And then there are the myths. Masonry tells the story of Hiram Abbey, the master builder of Solomon's Temple, who was murdered for refusing to reveal the secrets of his craft. His story is central to Masonic ritual. He is the archetype of fidelity, of silent devotion to a higher truth. But Hiram is not found in early biblical texts. His story is a fabrication, a legend. So why is it told? Because it encodes a deeper message that true knowledge must sometimes be protected at the cost of one's life. That the word, the truth, is worth preserving even in silence. Is it coincidence that the Templars were centered on Solomon's temple? Is it coincidence that their leaders died refusing to confess, that Jacques de Molay on the scaffold retracted his confession and proclaimed the innocence of the order, that he too became a martyr for a hidden truth? Some believe that the Masonic Code is the echo of what de Molay took to the grave, and that within it lie pieces of a puzzle so carefully concealed that only fragments remain. Today the code lives on in rituals performed under candle light, in oaths whispered before symbols in lodges, hidden in plain sight above shops, behind churches, within libraries. But the question remains, are today's Freemasons the inheritors of an unbroken chain? Or are they simply the keepers of an echo? An echo that once had flesh and fire and blood, and now lives in allegory, in geometry, and in silence. There is a silence at the heart of Masonry. A gap, a blank space, a word that should be there but isn't. And in that silence, an entire tradition holds its breath. It's called the lost word, a central mystery in Masonic ritual. It is not a word forgotten by accident. It is a word deliberately veiled, withheld, symbolically buried. According to Masonic lore, the word was once known by the builders of Solomon's Temple, perhaps even by Solomon himself. But it was lost with the death of the master architect Hiram Abbey, murdered by fellow craftsmen who demanded a shortcut to divine knowledge. This myth is not just a story of treachery. It is an allegory of spiritual yearning. The search for the lost word is the search for truth itself, veiled, elusive, and sacred. And yet some believe it is more than metaphor. Some believe the word was real, or is, and that the Templars knew it. In certain early Masonic rites, especially in the Royal Arch and Templar degrees, the initiate is told that the lost word can be rediscovered, but only through a process of moral purification, symbolic death, and divine inspiration. It is not simply handed over. It must be earned. It must resonate on three levels: as a sound, as a symbol, and as a state of being. This echoes certain mystical teachings found far beyond Europe. In Jewish Kabbalah, the ineffable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, is said to carry the vibrational pattern of creation itself. In Islamic Sufism, the 99 names of Allah are pathways to divine intimacy. In Christian Gnosticism, hidden words logo unlock realms of inner knowledge. Across these traditions, the idea persists. Sacred language is not just a tool. It is a vessel of power. The Templars stationed in Jerusalem for over a century were exposed to all of this. Living in the former stables beneath the Temple Mount, guarding the sacred precincts of three religions, they absorbed ideas far older than Christianity. And though the official church doctrine condemned foreign teachings as heretical, the Templars operated beyond the Vatican's walls, often literally. They learned, they adapted, and perhaps they preserved. There are accounts fragmentary disputed that during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount, the Templars found something, a scroll, a relic, a secret. What exactly it was remains unclear, but it appears in Templar lore, encoded in allegory, and shielded by ritual. Some say it was the Ark of the Covenant, others the Holy Grail. But there is a third theory far stranger, that what they found was a name that vibrated, a name that healed, a name that shattered illusions. If this sounds like myth, it is. But myth in traditions like Masonry is not falsehood. It is encoded truth wrapped in layers to protect its essence from corruption or misuse. And in the rituals of Freemasonry, the lost word takes on this same quality. It is spoken only in fragments, syllables divided among three initiates. When the time comes, they each pronounce apart. Only together unified can the word be heard. The early Scottish rite rituals go further. In some, the word is substituted with a phrase mahaban or javelin. Nonsense words seemingly, but their structure suggests something more fragments of divine names from multiple traditions. Jah, Yahweh, Bulbulon Osiris or Helipolos. Each syllable carries echoes of ancient deities. Each syllable carries weight. This composite naming offends many. It blurs religious lines, mixes sacred texts. And yet that may be the point. Because if the Templars did carry forward a secret, it would not have been a purely Christian one. It would have been something broader, something older, something dangerous. And that danger lives in silence. The word is never shouted. It is never carved. It is never sung. It is only spoken in the lodge behind closed doors among initiates who have made the journey. That ritual silence mimics the vow of the Templars, those who kept their knowledge under threat of torture and flame. Even Jacques de Molay facing execution refused to speak what could not be spoken. This gives rise to a radical theory. What if the lost word is not a single utterance, but a cipher, a system, a formula that encodes the relationship between the divine and the human, between the builder and the blueprint? In Kabbalistic thought, letters are not just signs, they are forces. Hebrew in particular is seen as a language where each character is both sound and number. When arranged correctly, these letters form names, vibratory patterns that align the soul with God. The name of God, Yahweh, is never pronounced in Jewish tradition. It is ineffable, sacred, dangerous to speak. In Masonic tradition, that very idea returns. The word must be lost to be protected. Only the worthy may seek it. One Freemason writing anonymously in the 1800s hinted that the word was not a sound at all, but a principle. It is not spoken, but lived, not pronounced, but revealed in the geometry of action, the harmony of thought, the justice of the builder's hand. That is the true Masonic vision. Not just to build temples of stone, but to build the inner temple to recover the divine pattern lost in the chaos of the world. The word then is a cipher for the self, for the cosmos, for the bridge between them. And if the Templars had a fragment of that knowledge, if they had discovered a name, a number, a resonance, they would have buried it not in sand, but in ritual. And that ritual survives in every lodge where the initiate is blindfolded and led through darkness. In every moment where silence replaces speech. In every hand that passes the word not to the ears, but to the soul. So perhaps the word was never lost, only hidden, waiting in the echo of a name half remembered in a symbol only the worthy can read. And in the hush before a door opens somewhere beneath a compass beside a square and between two pillars of stone. To speak of secrets in Europe is eventually to speak of the Jesuits. Formed in the 16th century, the Society of Jesus became the Vatican's most disciplined arm. Not merely a religious order, but a military engine of influence, intelligence, and ideological enforcement. Wherever silence was being kept, the Jesuits seemed to listen. And wherever symbols whispered from older times, they seemed to follow. What does this have to do with the Freemasons or the Templars? Quite a lot. Because while history paints the Jesuits as defenders of Catholic orthodoxy, their true legacy is more ambiguous. They were also collectors of knowledge, languages, maps, rituals, and lore. And what they could not destroy, they often tried to absorb. And there was one thing in particular they pursued across continents through archives and interrogations. quietly and relentlessly, Templar knowledge. By the time the Society of Jesus was founded in 1540, the Templars had been gone for over 2 centuries, at least officially. But whispers of their survival had never truly faded. Jesuit missionaries stationed across Europe and the Near East encountered strange traditions. In Portugal, they found remnants of the Order of Christ. In Scotland, they found folk stories about hooded knights guarding secret vaults. In France and Italy, they found cryptic diagrams scrolled into monastery walls, often dismissed as heresy or madness, but always familiar. The Jesuits were particularly obsessed with symbols, especially the same symbols that kept appearing in early Masonic rituals: the twin pillars, the blazing star, the all-seeing eye. To the outside world, these were dismissed as harmless flourishes. But to the Jesuits, whose intellectual rigor was unmatched, they meant something, and their reaction was sharp. By the mid-600s, Masonic lodges began spreading across Europe. They were small at first, local, largely composed of architects, scholars, and merchants, but soon they grew bolder, more philosophical, more universal. The Jesuits noticed, and what they saw disturbed them. Here was a movement speaking of enlightenment without Christ, of sacred truth without the Church, of knowledge passed through ritual, not through Rome. And at the heart of it always was that lingering scent of the Templars, those same patterns of secrecy, initiation, and sacred geometry, the same fixation on Solomon's temple, the same oath-bound brotherhood that revered silence over sermon. To the Jesuits, it looked like the Templars had returned wearing new clothes. And so the counter-infiltration began. In the 1700s, several prominent Freemasonic lodges in Europe suddenly splintered. New Templar degrees began appearing in Masonic rites. A flood of new initiates came forward, some brilliant, some suspect. Strange schisms occurred. Rites once simple became tangled with excessive ceremony. Some say this was the natural evolution of a growing movement. But others believe the Jesuits inserted themselves into the Masonic system, co-opting its rituals, redirecting its currents, diffusing its original message. In France, where both the Jesuits and Freemasons held enormous sway, this infiltration reached fever pitch. Secret police documents from the reign of Louis XV reference Black Road agents attending lodge meetings under assumed names. In one case, a Masonic leader was arrested with a letter in his possession, a coded warning that the society has entered the temple. The meaning was clear: the Jesuits were inside. But why? What was their goal? Some say it was to destroy the Masons from within, to poison their structure, to erode their independence, to bury their radical ideas in rituals so dense it became meaningless. Others believe it was more subtle, that the Jesuits sought to learn what the Masons knew, that buried beneath layers of allegory, there remained a truth the Church had never fully uncovered. A fragment of the lost word, a cipher, a name. In some Masonic Templar rites, particularly those developed in the 18th century, we find sudden references to Christian mysticism, to Catholic saints, and even to Jesuit saints like Ignatius of Loyola. These inclusions are abrupt, out of character with earlier Masonic writings, and they appear not long after documented Jesuit efforts to study and monitor Masonic activity throughout Austria, Italy, and southern France. This Jesuit obsession wasn't limited to Europe. When the Jesuits arrived in the New World in the Americas, they brought with them not only the gospel, but their penchant for secrecy. Missionary outposts were built with hidden chambers, encoded designs, and strict internal hierarchies. Some of these settlements, like the famous Jesuit reductions in Paraguay, were effectively autonomous republics with a population of tens of thousands living under strict symbolic control. And curiously, their architecture contains markings that would not be out of place in a European lodge. A sun above an eye, columns bearing initials, altars that do not point east. Coincidence, perhaps? Or perhaps the Jesuits, like the Masons, were playing a longer game. It's worth noting that Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, was himself a former knight, a soldier who turned mystic, a man who understood both the blade and the spirit. Some scholars have drawn comparisons between Jesuit vows and Templar vows. Both orders demanded absolute obedience, secrecy, and readiness to act in hostile lands. Some even suggest the Jesuits modeled themselves on the Templars, rebuilding in their own way the disciplined worldwide network the Church had once destroyed. But the most chilling possibility is this. What if the Jesuits weren't chasing the Templars? What if they were protecting something for them? A relic, a name, a blueprint? We know that after the suppression of the Templars, many of their treasures were never recovered. Vaults in Paris were found empty. Records vanished. Ships disappeared. Is it possible that some portion of that knowledge made its way not to Freemasonry, but to the Church itself, and that the Jesuits were its stewards in 1773 under pressure from monarchs and Masonic-friendly powers? Pope Clement I formally suppressed the Jesuit order. Their assets were seized, their archives confiscated, their secrets locked away. But just 41 years later, the order was restored. Why? What was so valuable? What could not be allowed to die? And did it have anything to do with the memory of a brotherhood that had vanished 4 centuries earlier, but never truly gone? The Jesuit obsession, then, may have been more than ideological. It may have been personal, an ancient rivalry, a debt unpaid, or a shared secret so immense it could not be buried with any one order. A word not lost, but waiting in silence, protected, watched, whispered in dark corners of both temple and chapel, in ritual and in Rome. When the fires of revolution swept through Europe and the old world's empires trembled, something strange was quietly taking root across the ocean. A new land, a new nation, but also less obviously a new temple. In the American colonies, Freemasonry didn't just survive. It thrived. Lodges multiplied. Symbols resurfaced. And into this open, chaotic frontier poured men who believed in more than just liberty. They believed in the great work. Some were warriors, some were scholars, some were planters, printers, or lawyers. But a surprising number were Masons, and among them were names that now echo through American myth. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere. Founding fathers who didn't just sign declarations, they laid foundations, and they built them brick by symbolic brick on the scaffolding of Masonic ritual. The American lodges were different. They didn't bear the weight of European aristocracy or church suspicion. Here, Masons could speak more freely, organize more openly. And with that freedom came a curious merging of Enlightenment ideals and ancient echoes of Republican dreams and esoteric blueprints of revolution and ritual. Consider this: the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol was laid by George Washington himself in a full Masonic ceremony. Apron, trowel, the symbolic tools of the craft, all present. Prayers were read, offerings made. The ritual was not hidden. It was public. Yet few understood what it meant. Few still do. That cornerstone wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a declaration. This republic was being built not just with politics, but with purpose, spiritual, philosophical, Masonic. And the architecture of Washington, D.C. reflects it. The layout of the city, designed by Pierre Charlon, a known Freemason, contains deliberate alignments and geometric mysteries. The Capitol, the Washington Monument, the White House, all connected by invisible lines forming pentagrams, triangles, and compass angles. The obelisk of the Washington Monument, modeled after Egyptian sacred design, stands not merely as a tribute, but as a symbol of resurrection, of light-piercing shadow. On the dollar bill, the all-seeing eye above the pyramid. On the Great Seal, a hidden owl and 13 steps. On the streets themselves, the silent geometry of ancient principles mapped onto a new world. What were they trying to say? Some argue this was simply the aesthetic of the Enlightenment classical architecture, reason, symbolism. But it goes deeper than that, because these men weren't just borrowing classical forms. They were embedding something, a silent code, a set of principles older than the Enlightenment and more mystical than the Constitution. They were building a temple not of stone, but of ideals. And they were doing it with tools inherited from somewhere older, Templar perhaps. The lodges of colonial America were filled with Masonic degrees that referenced Solomon's temple's sacred geometry and the search for the lost word. But in the higher orders, especially the Templar degrees of the York and Scottish rites, things became more explicit. The cross appeared, the red mantle, the vow to protect the innocent and uphold truth even at the cost of life. Why in a secular republic were its leaders swearing Templar oaths? Why were they enacting dramas of betrayal, silence, and resurrection? Unless perhaps the rituals were more than pageantry, unless they were memory. Benjamin Franklin, ever the rationalist, was also fascinated by hidden knowledge. He corresponded with Masonic lodges in France, England, and Scotland. He was a member of the Royal Society. And yet in private letters he wrote cryptically of fragments of truth scattered like stars across the heavens, which must be reassembled into light. Was he speaking poetically, or was he referring to the scattered legacy of a brotherhood long thought extinct? There is another layer to this story buried deeper in American soil. In the 1800s, a series of strange vaults were discovered beneath churches and public buildings across the East Coast. Most were dismissed as storage spaces, but in a few curious symbols were found etchings of Templar crosses, Masonic compasses, and stars. One vault beneath an old lodge in Richmond, Virginia, bore an inscription carved in Latin verb paradit. Lux Mane. The word is lost. The light remains. These were not random carvings. They were declarations. Declarations that the search continued, that the Masonic dream, the alchemical fusion of reason, mysticism, and justice had survived the suppression of the Templars, the wars of Europe, the corruption of kings. And now in this new world, it had a chance to be reborn. But nothing hidden stays hidden for long. In 1826, a scandal rocked American Freemasonry. A man named William Morgan, once a Mason, threatened to publish a book exposing the order's secrets. Before the book could be released, Morgan disappeared. His body was never found. The event sparked outrage. Lodges were burned. Anti-Masonic political parties formed. The public wanted answers. And yet, the lodges endured. The rituals continued. The symbols remained on buildings, currency monuments, and with them the silent question. Had the Freemasons in the American experiment succeeded in what the Templars could not? Had they built a republic designed not just to survive, but to initiate the world into a new order, not one of domination, but of light, of knowledge, of truth encoded in silence? Today, many American Masons view their heritage as symbolic, moral, allegorical. And perhaps it is. But that doesn't erase the patterns, the rituals, the compass and square on grave markers, the blazing stars etched into city gates, the echoes of a brotherhood that claimed to protect sacred knowledge and to die rather than betray it. The American lodges may be only a chapter in that story, or they may be its culmination, the final experiment, a republic not just of laws but of symbols, a temple disguised as a nation. And at its heart still the word remains unsaid but not forgotten, just waiting. Some secrets are not buried in vaults. They are buried in blood. Long before the Freemasons laid the cornerstones of empires, long before the Jesuits whispered through the chambers of Europe, and even before the Templars rode out beneath crimson crosses, another kind of preservation was taking place. Quiet, relentless, genetic. It begins with a simple question. What if the Templars didn't just survive? What if they passed themselves down one generation to the next? Not just through ideas, but through family. The notion of bloodlines and secret orders is ancient. Royal dynasties understood it well. So did priestly castes from Egypt to Sumer to Israel. Sacred power was often believed to travel through blood, divine right, spiritual inheritance, chosen seed. And the Templars, once protectors of sacred spaces, were no strangers to such thinking. Though the official records paint them as celibate warrior monks, the truth is murkier. Many Templar knights came from noble families. Some left the order and re-entered civilian life. Some were quietly married, especially in regions like Portugal and Scotland where the crackdown was softer. And in those places, curious lineages begin to emerge. Let's start with Portugal. After the suppression of the order in 1312, Portugal refused to execute or exile its Templar knights. Instead, King Dinus negotiated with the Pope and reconstituted the Templars as the Order of Christ, a name change, nothing more. Their lands remained intact. Their hierarchy barely shifted, and their descendants, they remained quietly entrenched in Portugal's noble class. From that order came explorers like Henry the Navigator, who carried the Templar cross on their sails as they ventured into the unknown. Some of these men traced their ancestry, not just to royalty, but to Templar founders. In Portuguese records, noble families like the Almeidas Pereiras and Castros kept internal histories, genealogies that referenced knights of the temple as direct ancestors. But what's more intriguing is what these lineages did after the Templars were gone. They formed networks, intermarrying, sharing land, holding quiet influence in military, religious, and architectural circles, and in some cases appearing centuries later as prominent Freemasons. These weren't random initiates. They were legacy members, men who arrived at lodges already speaking the language of secrecy, of symbols of silent obedience. Now look to Scotland. Here the story sharpens. The Sinclair family lords of Rosslyn have long been associated with both the Templars and early Masonry. In the 15th century, William Sinclair built Rosslyn Chapel, a structure saturated with arcane carvings, stars plants from the New World, before it was discovered Masonic pillars and angels guarding what some say is a sealed vault beneath the chapel floor. The Sinclairs were hereditary patrons of stonemasons. But some believe they were more than patrons, that they were guardians. That within their bloodline ran not just money and power, but memory. The memory of rights of knowledge too dangerous to write down. and from their family, across the Channel, over generations, come others. In France, the dear Rochefoucauld, who resisted the papacy's suppression of the Templars. In Germany, the Vines who appear in Grail, legends linked to Templar-like knightly orders. In Switzerland, the von Habsburgs, who harbored renegade knights and grew wealthy off their gold. And in England, the Dev and Neville families who some claim held ancestral Templar land long after the crown had seized it. Are these just noble houses with long memories? Or are they threads of something older? The conspiracy theory emerges that these families formed a hidden network, a shadow aristocracy protecting ancient knowledge and keeping the flame of the Templars alive. And when the time was right, they helped birth a new vessel, Freemasonry. In this theory, the lodges of the 17th and 18th centuries weren't just social clubs or philosophical societies. They were protective shells constructed by dynastic families to initiate new blood and preserve old secrets. Not every Mason was aware, but those in the higher degrees, those with the right surnames, they were not merely inheriting symbolism. They were continuing a bloodline ritual. There's one more piece to this puzzle. It arrives from the shadows of the Holy Grail. Many modern Grail legends, including the controversial claims made in books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, propose that the Templars discovered something beneath Solomon's temple. Not gold, not scrolls, but genealogical proof. A living bloodline descended perhaps from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, hidden from the world, protected by knights, preserved in noble houses through carefully arranged marriages. It's a sensational claim, and one widely dismissed by mainstream historians. But if we view it not as literal truth but as metaphor or encoded signal, it aligns eerily with the behavior of these ancient families. Guarding secrets, hiding knowledge in architecture, initiating only the worthy, obeying a code of silence that outlived kingdoms, and in some cases reappearing centuries later at the heart of revolutions, Masonic movements, or elite financial institutions, not through conspiracy but through inheritance. To those who believe this theory, bloodlines are not just DNA. They are vessels, like the chalice in Grail mythology. They are meant to carry something, an idea, a memory, a word. And that word lost long ago in a burning chapel or a prison cell in Paris now moves silently through the veins of the living. Not all Freemasons are part of this. Most are initiates of principle drawn by philosophy. But within the higher degrees, particularly in rites that echo Templar liturgies, some whispers persist. A lineage remains. It does not rule. It remembers, not for power, but for purpose, to protect what cannot be spoken, to preserve what should never be lost, and to awaken when the time is right. Because perhaps the true legacy of the Templars is not buried in treasure or text, but walks quietly among us, hidden not by distance, but by name. The Holy Grail is not a cup. Not really, not just. It is an idea, a riddle wrapped in allegory endlessly reimagined. A chalice, a relic, a book, a woman, a bloodline, a vault, a state of consciousness. The stories contradict one another, yet converge in one truth. Something powerful, sacred, and hidden has moved through our collective memory for centuries. And wherever this Grail appears, the Templars are not far behind. The medieval Grail legends, those written in the 12th and 13th centuries, arrived almost in parallel with the rise of the Knights Templar. Christian de Wolfer von Achenbach and Robert de Boron each wrote tales that blurred Christian theology with strange earlier traditions. Suddenly knights were not just warriors. They were seekers, protectors of sacred objects, guardians of mysteries passed down from before the church itself. In these tales, the Grail is more than a cup from the Last Supper. It is a vessel of light, a thing that heals, a thing that chooses, and it is always hidden, always protected by a secret brotherhood. Knights who live apart from the world, bound by oaths and destined to reveal the truth only when the time is right. How familiar! Woolram's version is especially curious. He names the Grail Guardians as Templars long before the order fell under suspicion, long before it was fashionable to link them to such stories. He calls them the Templars and men of purity, who live atop a mystical mountain protecting the Grail from the unworthy. The implication is clear. They are not simply military monks. They are vessels of sacred knowledge. But what knowledge here? The legends grow bolder. Some versions of the Grail myth, particularly those adapted in the 20th century, suggest the Grail was not a thing, but a person, a bloodline. The Srael Holy Grail becomes Srael royal blood. In this view, the Grail is the preserved lineage of Christ and Mary Magdalene hidden from the church, protected by secret orders. It is heresy, of course. But heresy has power, and the Templars, it must be remembered, were condemned not for what they did, but for what they were believed to know. When the Inquisition interrogated the Templars, they were obsessed with a single question. What had they found beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in the oldest of sacred spaces? The Church wanted to know if the Templars had uncovered something dangerous, a relic, a gospel, a truth that could unravel the very foundation of Christian doctrine. Many confessed to worshipping a head, a figure named Baphomet, a distorted name perhaps, or a cipher. Others spoke of secret knowledge rituals involving kisses, denials of the cross, and strange rites of rebirth. But under torture, words lose meaning. The Church called it heresy, but hidden in the scattered confessions is a consistent thread. The Templars believed they had found something they could not reveal, and they protected it to the death. Now consider this. In the years following the Templars' fall, a flurry of Grail-related legends appear across Europe. In southern France, where many Templars fled, local legends speak of holy families, buried relics, and secret guardians. The region of Languedoc becomes ground zero for a swirl of mysticism, Cathar beliefs, and Grail stories. Ranlateau, Monner, caves and castles and chapels, all connected by the silent geometry of old maps and forgotten texts. Some believe the Templars carried the Grail here, not the cup itself, but the knowledge, the bloodline, the truth. It is no coincidence that modern Grail theorists often focus on this region. And it is no coincidence that Freemasonry, when it emerges centuries later, carries with it echoes of these same themes. Secret knowledge, sacred geometry, a word that has been lost and must be rediscovered by the worthy. In Templar-themed Masonic rites, especially those of the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, the Grail appears not in name but in concept. The initiate passes through symbolic death as purified, and becomes the vessel for a mystery that cannot be written. The Master Mason becomes a kind of living Grail one, who holds the unspoken truth within. Some Masonic tracing boards even show the Ark of the Covenant flanked by two cherubim beneath which it was said lay the tablets of divine law. But in others that space is left blank. The word is gone. Only the initiate can seek it. Here the Grail returns less as relic, more as principle, a vessel of silence, a container of the ineffable. But what if the Grail was more than myth? There are persistent claims unverified, tantalizing that the Templars did indeed find something in Jerusalem. Not gold, not artifacts, but records, genealogies, writings that predated the Gospels, a version of history that contradicted Rome's. If so, the implications are enormous. The Church's authority was built not just on faith, but on blood, the lineage of Peter, the apostolic succession, the idea that Rome alone carried the keys to heaven. If the Templars found evidence of a parallel line, a sacred bloodline outside the Church, then they didn't just carry a secret. They carried a threat. One they could never speak aloud. One they encoded in symbols, in stone, in families, in rites passed hand to hand, lodge to lodge, generation to generation. That is the deepest Grail mystery, that it is not lost, only hidden, protected not by walls, but by men who remember. And perhaps the Freemasons were never just builders of cathedrals. Perhaps they were guardians of a different cathedral, one made not of stone, but of flesh, a body of memory, a Grail that walks, breathes dreams. A lineage that outlived the sword, the scaffold, the fire, waiting for the moment when the veil would lift and the word would return. Not in chalice, not in stone, but in the blood and in the silence that holds it. Walk through any old city, and you might think you're seeing ordinary buildings, offices, chapels, libraries. Yet hidden in their corners, etched into walls or staring from rooftops, are symbols that were never meant to be obvious. Not to everyone, but to those who know the initiated. These signs whisper stories. And some of those stories begin with the Templars and continue through the Freemasons. Symbols are their language, not just decoration, but declaration, not superstition, but structure. Each one a piece of a silent code meant to survive time, fire, persecution, even memory. Let's begin with the double-headed eagle. To most, it might seem like a medieval curiosity, a bird with two heads, crowned wings spread. But to those in the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, it's something far more. It represents duality, earth and spirit, east and west, death and rebirth. But the eagle also appears in older emblems on Byzantine banners, Roman crests, and yes, certain Templar-era seals. It is not simply a bird. It is a sentinel facing in two directions, guarding something central. And then there are the two pillars, Jachin and Boaz, biblical names taken from the first Temple of Solomon. In Freemasonry, they appear in every lodge, symbolizing strength and establishment. But these pillars also appear in medieval churches, on Templar tombs, and more intriguingly on coats of arms of certain noble families. Always paired, always guarding a doorway. Doorways to what? Initiation? Memory. The inner chamber where truth resides. Now look to the compass and square. Perhaps the most iconic Masonic image, usually with the letter G in the center. Ask a dozen Freemasons what that letter stands for, and you'll hear God. Geometry nauseous. But deeper interpretations say it stands for the great architect, a veiled reference to a creative force that transcends religion. And yet, long before it became a Masonic emblem, similar tools appeared in cathedral carvings, Templar manuscripts, and even ancient Mesopotamian imagery. Why? Because architecture and geometry were never just about building. They were about encoding, embedding meaning in proportion, in angle, in silence. Templar architecture reflects this. Their chapels, circular, minimalist, precise, mirror the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, not to please Rome, but to remember, to reflect, to encode. The famous Temple Church in London, built by the Knights, is filled with mathematical proportions that align with solstices, equinoxes, and cosmic ratios. Geometry as prayer in Masonic lodges. Similar patterns emerge. Tracing boards, painted panels used in ritual show suns, moons, ladders ascending into stars. The blazing star shines above the altar. The checkered floor reflects duality, light and darkness, wisdom and ignorance. But these are not new inventions. They're continuations. They draw directly from Templar motifs, Gnostic diagrams, Kabbalistic pathways. Even the skull and crossbones, so often misunderstood as pirate imagery, is in fact Masonic and Templar. It appears on Templar tombstones carved into stone centuries before the golden age of piracy. It symbolizes mortality, yes, but also transformation. A reminder that the flesh passes, but the word remains. And what of the rose and cross found in both Rosicrucian and Templar lore? It symbolizes resurrection, spiritual flowering from suffering. The rose a living thing, the cross a place of death. Together they speak of what lies beyond. Some claim this symbol encapsulates the Grail myth itself, bloodline, and sacrifice, secret, and survival. Now imagine how these symbols spread. Not through sermons, but through stone. Through the silent labor of masons who embedded stars into ceilings, crosses into thresholds, compass angles into floor plans. Look at Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame, Rosslyn Chapel. They are not merely places of worship. They are three-dimensional prayers filled with encoded meanings, alchemical, astronomical, esoteric. Rosslyn especially defies explanation. Built in the 15th century by the Sinclair family, alleged Templar descendants, it contains carvings of aloe and maize plants not known in Europe until after the discovery of the New World. There are depictions of the Ark of the Covenant musical cubes, thought to encode a hidden chant, and 22 apprentice pillars, possibly referencing the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Coincidence or code? In Washington, D.C., the story continues. The Capitol Rotunda shaped like the Pantheon. The Washington Monument, a perfect Egyptian obelisk aligned to celestial points. The pentagram formed by streets around DuPont Circle. Imperfect, yes, but intentional. The Goddess of Liberty atop the Capitol dome. Not the Virgin Mary, but a Roman goddess crowned in stars. It's as if someone took the old blueprints, the Templar geometry, the Masonic symbols, and projected them onto a new world. Not as nostalgia, as prophecy. These patterns are not accidental. They are instructions not for control, for remembrance. Because symbols are how knowledge survives when words cannot. When the Templars were extinguished, they didn't write confessions. They carved signs, passed tokens, hid meanings in sight, the double cross in a coat of arms, the rose entwined in stone, the orientation of graves, the angles of corridors, a system not of secrecy but of selectivity, truth visible only to those trained to see it. Freemasonry inherited this system, expanded it, adapted it, but at its core it remains the same. A way to say what cannot be said, a way to preserve what cannot be proclaimed, a way to continue what must never die. Even today, Masonic lodges build their altars in the east toward the rising sun. Their ceremonies echo ancient steps from darkness to light, from death to rebirth, from ignorance to the lost word. And the symbols remain, etched into metals, pressed into rings, hung above doorways, hidden in churches, carved into tombs. And if you follow them one to the next, from Paris to Lisbon, from London to Alexandria, from Washington to Jerusalem, you begin to see the outline of something enormous. Not a conspiracy, a map of memory, of silence, of survival. The Templars may have fallen, but their language remains. It speaks in angles, in echoes, and always in symbols, waiting to be read. There is a room beneath Rome where time stands still. A corridor lit dimly flanked by steel doors and cold marble. Behind those doors lie secrets the world was never meant to read. In Latin they call it Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican's secret archive. Now renamed the Apostolic Archive. But make no mistake, its essence remains unchanged. This is not a dusty library. It is a vault of power, and within it lies a story the Church has never fully told about the Knights Templar, about what they knew, and perhaps about why they had to disappear. The archive stretches across 50 miles of shelving. It contains letters from emperors, papal bulls, maps, trial transcripts, personal correspondence of popes dating back over 100 to 200 years. But the part we are interested in, the documents that may change history, are those dealing with the trial and suppression of the Templars. For centuries, these records were inaccessible. Scholars were told they had been lost or else buried too deep to retrieve. But in 2001, an Italian paleographer named Barbara Fraile made a discovery that shook the historical world. She found a document known as the Chinon parchment misfiled for centuries. Its contents were astonishing. It revealed that in 1308, Pope Clement Vivim had secretly absolved the Templars of heresy. After personal interviews and papal investigation, he declared that while some rituals were strange, they did not constitute heresy. The Templars were to be forgiven and reinstated. But that never happened. Instead, under immense political pressure from King Philip IV of France, a man deeply in debt to the Templars, Clement reversed course. He suppressed the order 2 years later. Many knights were tortured, executed, or driven into hiding. This revelation reframes everything. The Church knew the Templars were not guilty. But they buried the truth, and they buried the documents. Why was it to appease a king? Or was it to prevent something deeper from being revealed? Because the Chinon parchment is not the only curious item in the archive. There are whispers, mostly from insiders and former scholars, that the Vatican holds other materials, scrolls recovered by the Templars during their excavations under Solomon's Temple, early Christian Gospels that differ radically from the canonical texts, genealogies, maps of Jerusalem predating Herod's temple, and even diagrams of the original Temple Mount marked with Templar geometry. None of these have been confirmed. But why are so many of these records sealed under papal authority? Only a handful of people on earth can access the deeper archive sections. Even cardinals must request permission. Most requests are denied. In 2010, the Vatican published a limited edition volume titled Processus contra Templarios, containing a facsimile of the Chinon parchment. Only 799 copies were printed. Most went to museums and universities. Critics asked why now? Why after 700 years would the Church release this? The official explanation was transparency. But the timing is curious. Freemasonry had been rising in public interest. Grail theories were proliferating in books and film. The Templar mythos had returned to popular culture with force. Perhaps the Vatican was trying to control the narrative, release just enough truth to quell speculation without revealing the rest. Because buried under Rome in temperature-controlled vaults behind reinforced doors are not just documents. There are relics, items too controversial for public view, bones, vessels, tablets etched with writing no scholar has fully deciphered. Among these artifacts, some researchers speculate is a Templar Codex, a document of unknown origin, possibly brought back from Jerusalem. Its pages are said to contain non-Christian symbols, astronomical alignments, and a phrase repeated in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. The light is veiled, but not extinguished. Is it real? No one can confirm. The Vatican will not comment. But the very idea aligns with Templar tradition, the safeguarding of ancient wisdom, the veiling of light. More disturbing is what's missing. Entire volumes on the Templar interrogations in southern France vanished. Records of Jacques de Mol's final hours redacted. The names of certain high-ranking church officials who visited Templar sites in Portugal and Aragon after the suppression blotted out, as if someone went through history with a blade excising pieces too dangerous to leave behind. Some suggest the Jesuits had access to these sections of the archive. Their founder, Ignatius of Loyola, was permitted entrance shortly before the society was first suppressed in 1773. After their reinstatement in 1814, the Jesuits again gained favor in Rome. And curiously, some of their private libraries contain materials eerily similar to Masonic and Templar lore, sometimes older, coincidence or transfer. The Vatican insists that there is no conspiracy, that the archive is simply a repository of church history with restrictions designed only to protect fragile documents. And for the average researcher, that's true. You can read letters from Henry VIII, notes from Galileo's trial, and even papal decrees from the Middle Ages, but not the documents that matter most. Not the ones about Jerusalem, about the inner rites, about the relics. Those remain sealed. And here is the unsettling truth. The Vatican doesn't have to deny the Templar legacy. They just have to outlast it. Time erodus memory. Records fade. Names are lost. Symbols are misinterpreted. And slowly the past slips into myth. Unless someone preserves it. Unless someone passes it hand to hand, word by unspoken word. Unless a brotherhood survives not in marble halls, but in quiet rooms behind closed doors between men who still remember the silence that fell in 1312 when the church took what it could not explain and locked it away. In Rome, beneath saints and angels, the Templar story waits, not to be believed, but to be rediscovered, not to shock, but to illuminate. And perhaps one day, when the final veil lifts, we will read what the church once read and feared. That some lights, though hidden, never go out. There is a temple that no longer stands, not in Jerusalem, not in stone. And yet it is rebuilt every day ritually, symbolically in darkness and in light by those who remember its design not through blueprints but through initiation. Those men call themselves Freemasons, but what they build may be far older. It begins with the legend of Hiram Abbey, central to Masonic ritual. Hiram is the chief architect of Solomon's temple. According to Masonic lore, he possessed secret knowledge. The word a sacred truth passed down from divine origin. When enemies tried to force this word from him, he refused. He was murdered by 3 ruffians, buried in a shallow grave, and eventually raised from the dead by fellow initiates. Sound familiar? A murdered builder, a hidden word, a resurrection. To most, it's just allegory, a moral tale about integrity and perseverance. But some researchers argue the Hiram myth is a disguised retelling of something else, something far more ancient. Perhaps the death of a real architect, or the silencing of a brotherhood that knew too much, or the fall of a literal temple, and the vow to rebuild it in secret. Because Freemasonry is obsessed with temple building. Every degree, every ritual, every symbol revolves around the lost Temple of Solomon. The pillars, the chamber, the veil, the floor, the light from the east. Why such devotion to a structure that hasn't existed in 2,000 years? Unless it isn't about the building. Unless it's about what the building represented. Sacred geometry, the fusion of heaven and earth, the place where man meets God. The Templars, remember, took their name from that temple. Their headquarters in Jerusalem stood near, or perhaps atop, the ancient Temple Mount. And according to many, they excavated beneath it, looking not for treasure, but for secrets, blueprints, scrolls, devices. Some even say they found the foundation measurements of the first temple hidden maps or relics older than Solomon himself. And when the Templars fell, what they found didn't vanish. It went underground, and centuries later, it emerged reimagined within the rites of Freemasonry. Why else would Masons stage elaborate rituals inside lodges built to symbolically represent the Temple of Solomon? Why else would they trace every measurement to proportions found in ancient Hebrew architecture? Why else would initiates be told they are rebuilding the temple not in stone but in spirit? Because the temple is not just a place, it's a pattern. It's the axis where the material world and the divine touch. It is the grail in architecture, the lost perfection, the balance of light, sound number, and intent. In the 18th century, when Freemasonry exploded across Europe, this idea of a spiritual temple took on political and philosophical dimensions. Masons saw themselves as reformers, remakers of civilization. The old systems had collapsed. Monarchy, church, feudalism. But in its place, a new structure could be raised. A republic of light, a temple of reason. It was no coincidence that many early revolutionaries were Masons. The architects of the American and French revolutions, Washington, Jefferson, Lafayette, Danton, shared a belief that they were building not just governments, but constructs of moral geometry. What had been literal stone in Jerusalem became metaphorical stone in Philadelphia, Paris, and Vienna. Even the language remained. Masons still refer to one another as brothers. They call their work the craft. They describe the journey through degrees as ascending the steps to the inner sanctum. And in the highest degrees, especially the Templar degrees, the references become explicit. There is talk of vengeance for a martyred master, of a word lost and recovered, of a temple destroyed and restored not in one lifetime, but through the ages. One degree reenacts the recovery of a sacred scroll hidden beneath the ruins of the temple by 3 builders. Another describes the resurrection of Hiram, not as a man, but as a principle, as light, as memory returned to the world. In the Royal Arch degree, initiates seek out a buried vault beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. Inside it, they find a pedestal. Upon the pedestal, a sacred object. And upon that object, a name never spoken aloud. Why such theatricality? Why such focus? Because these are not just plays. They are repetitions. Ritual memory. A way to keep building what was once destroyed. A temple that cannot be conquered by fire or decree. One constructed in the mind, in the soul, in the symbolic body of the initiate. Some claim this is the ultimate legacy of the Templars. That they knew the temple would fall again. That physical stone would always be vulnerable. But ideas, patterns, symbols, those could be preserved. Those could be reborn inside secret rites. And so they passed on the tools, the compass, the square, the plumb line, the word. They did not rebuild Jerusalem's temple. They transformed it into cathedrals of silence, into lodges and chambers, into cities shaped like stars and spirals, into men who remembered the story of Hiram not as myth but as prophecy. Today, every Masonic lodge, whether in London or Cairo, in Paulo or Singapore, is built in symbolic alignment with the temple. Every ritual recalls its construction, its fall, and its resurrection. It is not nostalgia. It is intention. The Templars may have died, but the temple lives, not on a mount, but in the mind. And the builders continue stone by invisible stone, rising not toward heaven, but toward remembrance. Because the temple was never just a building. It was a mirror of man, of cosmos, of what once was, and what must rise again. Throughout history, the most powerful truths have not been taught in words but transmitted through experience. This was the essence of the ancient mystery schools from Egypt to Eleusis to Cumin. And it was also the hidden engine behind both the Templars and the Freemasons. Not everyone could be initiated. Not everyone should. There were rites, steps, veils, silences. The process wasn't a lesson. It was a transformation. And what little we know of the Templar initiation suggests it was deliberately shrouded in layers of meaning, secrecy, and symbolism, echoes that would one day reappear in Masonic ritual, almost as if nothing had ever been lost. The official accounts from the church trials describe strange ceremonies being received in darkness, swearing oaths on unknown relics, being kissed in odd places, renouncing the cross, only to later embrace it again in secret. To the Inquisition, these were signs of heresy, but seen through another lens. They resemble ancient rites of passage. The symbolic death and rebirth found in almost every initiatory tradition. Some scholars believe these confessions, despite being extracted under torture, hint at a more complex spiritual system, not a denial of Christ, but an effort to reconnect with something deeper and older than church orthodoxy. In this reading, the renunciation of the cross wasn't blasphemy. It was rejection of a corrupted institution, a casting off of the outer shell in order to grasp the inner mystery. That mystery had many names. In Gnostic texts, it is called the hidden light. In Kabbalah, it is the iron soft. In alchemy, it is the philosopher's stone. The Templars, whose presence in the Holy Land exposed them to Jewish mysticism, Islamic Sufism, and Eastern Christian monasticism, may have absorbed pieces of each tradition. Their initiation rites could have woven together fragments of lost Egyptian rituals, Pythagorean stages, Ignaean discipline, and early Christian sacraments. The goal was not loyalty to Rome. It was transformation of the self. When the Freemasons arose centuries later, their own initiation process mirrored the structure. The candidate is blindfolded, symbolically entering darkness. He is led into the lodge by the hand guided by a brother. He is challenged, questioned, purified. Then he is brought to light. At the moment his blindfold is removed, he sees the world anew, not just physically but philosophically. What he thought he knew must now be re-examined. He has died to the profane world and been reborn as a seeker. This exact sequence, darkness, ordeal, revelation is found in initiation stories across history. But in Freemasonry, each stage is codified. The degrees build upon one another. The entered apprentice is the beginner learning the tools. The fellow craft applies those tools. The master mason dies symbolically and is raised again. Higher degrees, especially in the Scottish Rite and York Riteite, delve deeper into allegory, integrating elements clearly derived from Templar legend: vengeance for a murdered master, recovery of a lost word, guardianship of sacred relics. There are even rites specifically titled Knight Templar in Masonic tradition. These are not accidental. They involve swords, vows, altars. They speak of a temple not made with hands eternal in the heavens. They carry forward a memory not written in books, but impressed upon the soul through ritual. The candidate may not realize it, but he is reenacting something echoing a process that may stretch back to the original Templar commanderies when knights knelt in the dark, swore their lives to something unseen, and were changed. One of the most mysterious elements of both traditions is the concept of the lost word. In Masonic lore, this is a divine name once known, then forgotten, and now sought again. It is never spoken aloud. In some rites, it is replaced by substitutes, hints, syllables, ciphers. The initiate is told that the true word was lost with the death of the master builder, and only those who passed through all degrees and trials might one day recover it. To the uninitiated, it may seem symbolic, but to the esoteric traditions that informed both the Templars and the Masons, this word was more than metaphor. It was power. It was identity. To speak the true name of God or of one's higher self was to unlock creation, and thus to hide the word was not to lose it, but to protect it. Other elements align just as curiously. The ritual use of geometry. The symbolism of the tools, the compass, the square, the tell, the plumb line, the architecture of the initiation chambers aligned with solstices and stars. The use of sacred numbers 3712. The tracing boards full of encrypted scenes meant to be unpacked only after years of contemplation. All of it suggests a lineage adapted, obscured, but never extinguished. It raises an uncomfortable question. If the Masonic rites truly are echoes of Templar initiation, how much of that knowledge has survived intact? Is it possible that men today are undergoing a rite originally designed in the shadows of the Crusades? Or even earlier, could this be the real legacy? Not treasure, not relics, but a process, a method for creating guardians of memory. Some initiates speak of inner changes, of sudden dreams, visions, intuitions after ritual work, of feeling connected to something vast and ancient. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a lineage sense, as if joining a silent conversation that has stretched across centuries, one that cannot be recorded or taught, only experienced. This is why secrecy mattered. Not to exclude, but to protect. The rites were not meant for display. They were vessels, carefully calibrated psychological journeys designed to break and rebuild the initiate to make him ready to hold something that could not be spoken. Modern Masonry, of course, often focuses on fellowship and charity. Many members never pursue the higher degrees or the esoteric interpretations. But within the more mystical lodges, the deeper work continues, not of conspiracy, but of preservation. Preserving a rite that once shaped warriors into spiritual men, preserving symbols whose meaning only emerges after years of inner labor, preserving the silence from which the word might one day rise again. So when we ask whether the Templars survived, perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps they were never meant to survive as knights, as a military order. Perhaps they evolved into something else, something quieter. Perhaps they laid down the sword and picked up the compass. Perhaps they vanished into ritual. And if that's true, then the Templars never died. They became the initiation. If the Templars dissolved into Freemasonry, then the question becomes, did they retain their influence? Because the true power of a secret society is not its rituals, but its reach, its ability to shape events from behind a veil. And here the line between myth and history begins to blur. Over the last 3 centuries, Freemasons have appeared in the biographies of revolutionaries, philosophers, architects, monarchs, presidents. From Enlightenment salons to the drafting of constitutions, from scientific minds to the founding of empires, the craft was there quietly, persistently, symbolically, never at the center, always close to it. Take the 18th century. In the decades leading to the American and French revolutions, Freemasonry spread like wildfire among the educated classes. Not only among the disenfranchised seeking reform, but among the elites, aristocrats, intellectuals, even clergy. Lodges became spaces where men could speak freely, where the hierarchies of the outer world were briefly suspended and replaced by a symbolic structure that rewarded merit, not birth. Titles didn't matter in the lodge, nor did church rank. What mattered was one's degree, one's understanding, one's inner progress. It was revolutionary not just socially but spiritually. And yet, it wasn't chaos. Freemasonry did not advocate disorder. Its highest ideal was order, cosmic, ethical, architectural. The revolution it offered was not one of anarchy, but of redesign. Tear down the corrupt structures. Rebuild in proportion, in balance, in light. A temple of reason. A republic of the initiated. It's no coincidence that many key figures in the American Revolution were Masons: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere. They didn't hide it. Washington even laid the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol in a Masonic ceremony wearing a Masonic apron. The city of Washington, D.C. itself was designed with Masonic symbolism. Its grid echoing geometric alignments, its monuments placed according to esoteric ratios. Was this superstition, symbolism, or the continuation of an older plan? In France, the pattern repeated. Before the storming of the Bastille, many of the revolutionary thinkers were Masons: Danton, Desmoulins, Robespierre. So were key nobles and philosophers. Lodges became the testing ground for Enlightenment ideals, the crucible in which old loyalties were dissolved and new identities formed. The French Revolution turned violent, yes, but its early vision was deeply Masonic: liberty, equality, fraternity, the triangle, the three pillars. And yet, Freemasonry was never monolithic. There were conservative lodges and radical ones. Lodges loyal to the crown and lodges dreaming of utopia. In some nations, Masons became agents of empire. In others, agents of its collapse. The craft moved between worlds, adapting its symbolism to local needs. But always beneath the variation, one idea endured, that real power lies not in thrones or mitres, but in those who understand structure. The design behind the veil. Some historians argue this influence has been exaggerated, that Masonry was more a social club than a secret order, that many Masons were ordinary men with no hidden agendas. And that's partly true, but it misses the point. Freemasonry didn't need to control every event. It just needed to be there at the pivot points. Like a keystone in an arch, it supports more than it seems to touch. Consider the British Empire. Many colonial governors were Masons. So were officers in the East India Company. The Grand Lodge of Kolkata, for instance, was founded in 1730 before the British Raj, before formal colonization. In many places, Masonic lodges were established even before churches or courts. They became meeting points, negotiation grounds, even early diplomatic channels. Not because Masonry sought domination, but because it understood structure precedes sovereignty. First you build the temple, then you occupy it. In the 19th century, nationalist movements across Europe and Latin America were often spearheaded by Masons. Simone Bolivar in South America, Joseph Garibaldi in Italy, leaders who used Masonic ideals to challenge empires to forge republics. Again, not because Freemasonry commanded them, but because its symbols and rites provided a grammar of rebellion, a way to imagine power differently, not as divine right, but as earned light. And yet, there was always a tension between the craft and the crown. In some places, monarchs embraced Freemasonry. Frederick the Great of Prussia was a Mason. So was Edward IV of Britain. In others, it was banned outright. The Catholic Church, in particular, viewed Masonry as a dangerous rival. Popes issued bulls condemning it. Priests who joined were excommunicated. Why such vehemence officially? The Church cited Masonry's secrecy and secularism. But perhaps it sensed something deeper. That Masonry carried a counter-theology, one rooted not in revelation, but in initiation. A world not governed by papal fiat, but by personal awakening. Not controlled by dogma, but by degrees. And in this we see the Templar legacy again. The Templars were once the Church's army until they became its rivals. Too wealthy, too connected, too strange. When they were suppressed, it wasn't just political, it was existential. The Church feared a shadow faith emerging within Christendom, one that wore the cross, but answered to a different authority. Perhaps Freemasonry inherited that same suspicion. Perhaps its very structure, the 3 degrees, the inner sanctum, the veiled knowledge was designed not just to transmit ideas, but to protect the lineage of power behind the altar. Because power, when refined, hides itself. It moves in shadows. It speaks through architecture, through ritual, through silence. Some claim that modern Freemasonry has lost this potency, that it is now symbolic, only no longer a hidden hand, but a quiet echo. That may be, but the symbols remain. The tracing boards, the blazing star, the lost word, and in certain lodges, in certain rites, the original fire still flickers quietly, patiently, because the craft was never about conquest. It was about continuity, about preserving a system of initiation that began long before the Enlightenment, possibly even before the Templars. A system that could outlast persecution, revolution, even obscurity. So when you ask who rules the world, don't look only to crowns and parliaments. Look to the symbols behind them, the angles of their buildings, the dates of their ceremonies, the oaths whispered in rooms without windows. Look to the architects, not the kings. Because history remembers the kings, but the temple was built by masons. There is a story whispered through symbols and echoed in stone. A story not just of architecture or allegiance, but of blood. Not spilled in war, but preserved through time. Because beneath the rituals, beneath the twin pillars and the sacred geometry, lies a more dangerous idea, that some knowledge was passed not only from teacher to student, but from father to son. That the legacy of the Templars and the Freemasons who followed might not merely be ideological, but biological. It begins with the Grail, not the chalice of legend, but the symbol behind it. In medieval romances, the Holy Grail is a mysterious object that grants wisdom, healing, and sometimes eternal life. In some tales, it is a cup, in others, a stone. But in the later French Grail cycles, especially those written after the fall of the Templars, a radical twist emerges. The Grail is no longer just an object. It is a bloodline, a lineage descending from Christ himself through a secret union with Mary Magdalene. It sounds like fiction, and perhaps it is, but the timing is peculiar. These reinterpretations appear just as the Templars are being hunted, tortured, and burned. And many of the earliest proponents of the Grail's bloodline theory had connections direct or literary to Templar patronage. It's almost as if as the physical order collapsed, a myth was being constructed to preserve their truth in another form. Fast forward to Freemasonry. One of the most enigmatic symbols in Hidery Masonry is the rose croix, the rose and the cross. It appears in the 18th degree of the Scottish Rite. To most it symbolizes resurrection and suffering, but to some esoteric scholars it's a veiled reference to the sacred feminine entwined with the masculine, a symbol of generative power. In certain Rosicrucian texts, the rose represents the womb, the mystery of life, the cross, the suffering that gives it meaning. This is not just mysticism. It's code, a continuation of the Grail myth disguised as philosophy. Now add to this the genealogical obsession of both the Templars and Freemasons. Throughout history, both groups placed immense emphasis on lineage. Many Templar recruits were of noble blood. Many Freemasons kept detailed family records. In some Hidery Masonic circles, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, members claimed descent from Rex Ds or Kings of God. Priestly families allegedly descended from ancient Israelite lines. A few even claimed descent from Christ himself. Again, it sounds fantastical, but the persistence of this idea across centuries and countries suggests it wasn't just the fantasy of a few eccentric minds. It was a narrative structure carefully maintained. A whisper that true authority, true enlightenment did not come from institution or ordination, but from blood, sacred blood. One of the most controversial pieces of this puzzle lies in southern France in the region known as Occitania. This is Cathar country. Gnostic Christians who believed the physical world was a prison and the spirit divine. The church branded them heretics and launched the Albigensian Crusade to destroy them. But before they vanished, some Cathar families reportedly passed their secrets to protectors. Those protectors, some believe, were proto-Templars. And in the centuries that followed, the same regions saw the rise of strange families, noble houses, with Templar connections with rumored ties to ancient priesthoods, and with heraldic symbols echoing Grail lore. The House of Sinclair in Scotland is one such example. They built Rosslyn Chapel, a structure drenched in esoteric symbolism, Hebrew pillars, Masonic geometry carvings of aloe, and maize before Columbus's voyage. The Sinclairs were hereditary Grand Masters of Scottish Freemasonry, and they claimed descent from Templar survivors who fled France after the Purge. Some researchers argue the family guarded a secret, one tied not just to relics or rites, but to bloodline. A human legacy passed through generations, encoded in architecture and ritual. In Masonic tradition, bloodlines are rarely mentioned openly, but they manifest symbolically. In rituals where lineage grants the right to hold certain keys and degrees, where the initiate becomes the son of the widow, a cryptic phrase possibly referencing the lineage of Hiram, or perhaps even older messianic traditions. There is an undercurrent in many rites, the idea that some knowledge is inherited, not just learned. And this leads us to the uncomfortable overlap between Freemasonry and monarchy. Many royal families across Europe had Masonic ties. Some even served as Grand Masters. Why? Because the idea of sacred kingship, the divine right to rule, shares a curious affinity with the idea of sacred blood. If certain families believed they descended from Davidic lines, or even from Christ, their involvement in a society that preserved the word makes a strange kind of sense. They were not just rulers, they were guardians of what a truth too explosive to be uttered. That the Church suppressed not just a heretical order, but a rival claim to spiritual authority. One grounded not in papal succession, but in flesh and blood. Of course, this cannot be proven. The evidence is fragmentary ritual phrases, symbolic patterns, buried references in esoteric texts. But the persistence of the narrative suggests its function to bind members of the Brotherhood, not just by oath, but by origin to create a myth of continuity, one that transcends persecution time and dogma. Even today, certain esoteric Masonic groups like the Societas Roggiana or various Martinis orders speak in terms of initiatic lineage not as metaphor, but as living threaded descent, not just of teachings, but of essence. The Grail in this view is not an object or idea. It is a person, a vessel that walks, a soul that remembers. Could such a person exist? A descendant of Christ, of David, of a priestly order preserved through Templar guardianship and Masonic ritual? It is impossible to say. But if they did, they wouldn't be a king. They would be quiet, hidden, initiated. They would speak not in proclamations, but in symbols. They would not claim power. They would carry it. And perhaps that's the secret the Church feared most. Not that the Templars found treasure, but that they protected a line. And that line survived not in palaces, but in lodges, in memory, in blood. The Templars were architects of a kind, designers of fortresses, planners of commanderies, engineers of power. But the Freemasons who claimed their legacy took that impulse further. With compass and square, they reshaped not just buildings, but ideologies and nations. And nowhere is this legacy more pronounced than in the birth of the modern democratic experiment, the founding of the United States. A republic founded not on monarchy or religious absolutism, but on principles so esoteric, so geometrically precise that many historians still fail to recognize the blueprint beneath the parchment. Because America at its inception was not only a political rebellion, it was a Masonic construction both symbolically and quite literally. Begin with the Founding Fathers. George Washington was a lifelong Mason and served as worshipful master of his lodge in Virginia. He famously wore Masonic regalia while laying the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol in 1793, using a silver tell and ceremonial tools straight from the Masonic rite. Benjamin Franklin, another key architect of the nation, was not only a Mason but the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. He also had close ties to the French Masonic intelligentsia and helped foster transatlantic Masonic dialogue during the Enlightenment. Many other figures, John Hancock, Paul Revere, James Monroe, even Lafayette, were initiates, and they viewed the American project through the lens of craft philosophy, order out of chaos, liberty through discipline, structure through virtue. But it wasn't just the men. It was the design itself. Washington, D.C. was laid out under the direction of Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French architect deeply influenced by Masonic principles. The city's radial plan is a series of intersecting axes, triangles, and symbolic alignments. The Capitol and the White House sit on points that echo solstitial angles. The streets connect through geometric patterns forming Masonic symbols like the compass and square, the pentagram and the blazing star. To a casual observer, it's just urban planning. But to those initiated into sacred geometry, it's a message encoded in stone. And then there's the Great Seal of the United States. On the reverse side, we find a 13-step pyramid topped with an all-seeing eye, the Eye of Providence. Above it, Annuit Coptus. He has favored our undertakings. Below, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. While officially these phrases are rooted in Roman literature, the symbolism goes deeper. The unfinished pyramid is a classic Masonic motif, symbolizing the ongoing work of building a just society. The eye represents divine oversight, but also gnosis, the inner sight attained through initiation. These are not arbitrary emblems. They reflect an esoteric worldview that sees politics not merely as governance, but as ritual architecture. In fact, some scholars have argued that the founding of the United States was itself a kind of mass ritual, an enactment of Masonic ideals on a national scale. The Constitution mirrors Masonic balance, executive, legislative, judicial, a tripartite system aligned like the three pillars of the lodge. The Bill of Rights offers moral and philosophical principles akin to the Masonic charges handed down to initiates. Even the very concept of a federal republic, a union of free individuals bound by oath and principle, mirrors the internal structure of a Masonic lodge. But this influence didn't stop in America. Across the Atlantic, French Freemasons played a quiet but crucial role in fermenting the intellectual and political revolutions of the 18th century. The salons of Paris were filled with men who wore the apron under their jackets and debated not only Locke and Voltaire, but also alchemical Kabbalistic and Hermetic texts. In the wake of the French Revolution, Masonic rites spread rapidly through Europe and into the colonies. The New World was not just geographic. It was ideological, spiritual, and initiatic. In Latin America, leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin were deeply influenced by Masonic ideals. Their revolutions against the Spanish Empire were often planned in Masonic lodges, and their visions for independent republics carried echoes of the American experiment: secular governance, codified rights, symbolic architecture. Lodges became spaces for revolutionary planning, but also for education discipline and the cultivation of what Masons called the inner temple. The message was clear. If you want to change the world, you must first reshape the man. This philosophy reached far beyond politics. The rise of public schools, civic architecture, secular constitutions, and scientific minds all bore the fingerprints of Masonic organization. Not because the craft controlled these movements, but because it had seeded the idea of building a rational, moral, and symbolically coherent society, one structured not on blood or inheritance, but on initiation, on those willing to work the stone. It's important to remember that Freemasonry in its deepest form is not a religion. It does not offer salvation. It offers structure, a way of constructing the self and the world. The temple in Masonic terms is always unfinished. Every initiate is a builder, and every generation inherits the tools to continue the work. In this way, the foundation of new nations, the writing of laws, the raising of monuments, the planning of cities becomes an extension of the original task, rebuilding the Temple of Solomon, not in Jerusalem but everywhere. Critics of this theory often claim there is no proof of a centralized Masonic conspiracy. And they're right. That's the point. Freemasonry doesn't operate through coercion. It operates through symbolic consensus. It doesn't need to issue commands when it has inspired designs. It doesn't need a leader when every initiate sees himself as a master builder. And yet some worry this influence has waned, that the great experiments seeded by Masonic ideals have drifted from their source, that today's institutions, though built on sacred ratios and noble oaths, have lost their sense of the work. The capital still stands, the seal still bears the eye. But does anyone remember why perhaps that forgetting is part of the plan? A true mystery school does not preserve its teachings through proclamation, but through architecture, through the memory embedded in stone, in ritual, in the quiet act of laying one brick atop another with intention. So yes, the Templars may have died. Their order was burned, erased, scattered, but their vision of a world built on sacred principle was not extinguished. It was passed on brick by invisible brick until one day it appeared as a nation, a republic, a new world temple. And even if few remember the structure, remembers the alignments remain. The symbols still speak. You just have to know how to read the plans. If the Templars vanished and the Freemasons inherited their legacy, then that legacy had to be hidden in plain sight, not in scrolls or manifestos, but in structures, in architecture, in design. Because unlike books, buildings do not burn as easily. They endure. They transmit meaning across centuries, across cultures, and across languages. They are silent scriptures. And so the Brotherhood, whoever they truly were, left their teachings not just in lodges, but in stone, in cities, in cathedrals, in monuments that millions pass by every day unaware that they are walking through a carefully constructed temple without walls. One of the clearest examples is Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. Built in the 15th century by William Sinclair, a descendant of a family with alleged Templar ties, the chapel is a masterwork of coded architecture. It features over 100 green men of pre-Christian fertility symbol. It contains carvings of maize and aloe plants native to the Americas at least 50 years before Columbus sailed. The entire interior is designed with Masonic geometry, and some scholars believe it maps out Kabbalistic teachings and the path of initiation. More than a church, Rosslyn is a stone cipher linking Christian pagan Templar and Masonic symbolism into a single matrix. But Rosslyn is just one example. Consider the Gothic cathedrals of Europe, many of which were built by stonemasons who would later form the operative roots of Freemasonry. These cathedrals were not merely places of worship. They were constructed to mirror heavenly patterns on earth. Notre Dame in Paris, for instance, follows sacred proportions drawn from Pythagorean and Platonic ideals. Its rose windows, labyrinth, and solar alignments encode astronomical and mystical knowledge. The builders worked in teams that preserved esoteric knowledge through tools, measurements, and craft passing secrets, not through speech but through angle and weight and light. And then there are the obelisks, ancient symbols of solar power and phallic energy, later co-opted by the Masons and found standing prominently in cities like Paris, London, and Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument itself is more than a patriotic structure. It is an Egyptian obelisk built on a Masonic foundation stone placed with ritual precision. Its height 555 foot, including base, translates to 6,660, in a number charged with mystical associations. Its capstone, made of aluminum, a rare metal at the time, is inscribed with the words Laus Deo, praise be to God, facing east toward the rising sun. Walk through the city, and the pattern continues. The U.S. Capitol sits at the eastern end of the National Mall, facing a straight line that connects it to the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. This alignment mimics the layout of ancient temples where the rising sun would illuminate the altar. The streets of D.C. form triangles, stars, and Masonic compasses when viewed from above. Is this coincidence? Or was the city designed as an open-air temple, encoding the values and mysteries of the builders into its very layout? Move west, and the design continues. The layout of Salt Lake City, founded by Mormon leader Brigham Young, a man deeply influenced by Freemasonry, echoes symbolic grids found in esoteric cosmology. The Mormon temple itself is filled with Masonic and astrological motifs, and early Mormon initiation rites were strikingly similar to those of the Masons, suggesting a shared source or deliberate adaptation. Across the ocean, the same patterns appear. The Place de Concorde in Paris features an Egyptian obelisk flanked by fountains representing duality, a Masonic motif. The Eiffel Tower, designed by Gustave Eiffel, a known Freemason, stands on a base aligned with sacred geometrical proportions. Even the layout of Versailles, with its sun motifs and axial design, can be read as an allegorical representation of order imposed on chaos, a theme central to both Hermeticism and Freemasonry. Further still, in cities like Buenos Aires, Paulo, and Manila, we find similar structures, grand civic buildings, monuments, and plazas arranged in accordance with Masonic design principles. These were often built during times of political transition, revolutions, declarations of independence, post-colonial state building, when new elites, many of them Masons, sought to imprint order onto the newly forming civic identity. And so they turned to the oldest symbols they knew: the compass, the square, the unfinished pyramid, the rising sun. Even in places where Freemasonry was officially banned or persecuted, like Nazi Germany, Francoist Spain, or the Soviet Union, these symbols managed to survive hidden in art theater and private buildings. The idea of sacred architecture was not extinguished. It simply retreated. This global presence raises an unsettling possibility that the world we live in is not entirely secular. That beneath the glass towers and traffic grids lies a symbolic infrastructure, a network of esoteric meaning accessible only to those who know the code. That perhaps the most visible signs of modernity, monuments, city plans, public buildings, are also the most ancient in function. Not as places to visit, but as nodes in a ritual system designed to orient the soul, align the body, and awaken memory. In some cases, the symbolism is overt. In others, it is buried deep beneath layers of civic design and bureaucratic language. But once you learn to see it, it's everywhere. The twin columns, the checkerboard floor, the all-seeing eye, the steps in 3s, 7s, and 12s, the placement of entrances and altars along equinoxial lines, the repetition of sacred ratios, fipi, the vesica petitius, and always the suggestion that what you see is only part of what exists. Some believe this architectural legacy is proof of a hidden hand guiding human civilization slowly, carefully, intentionally. Others argue it's simply the echo of a once powerful tradition now forgotten by all but a few. But whether or not a conscious group still controls the plan, the structures remain. The temples still stand, and in them the symbols continue to speak. They speak of balance, of ascent, of the eternal return. They speak of the Templars who may have encoded their knowledge in fortress chapels and sacred geometry. They speak of the Freemasons who ritualized those symbols and spread them across continents. And they speak of the temple within which each initiate is called to build stone by stone, symbol by symbol, in silence. So perhaps we are surrounded by temples. Perhaps every courthouse, every university, every Capitol rotunda is part of a vast, unacknowledged ritual space. Not to deceive, but to remind, to point the seeker back to the center where the compass turns, where the light falls, where the true initiation begins. And maybe that's the oldest secret of all. Not that power hides itself, but but that it reveals itself only to those who learn to see. But inside the craft, something essential had shifted. The higher degrees, the philosophical, mystical, initiatic content were increasingly viewed as symbolic flourishes rather than maps to real transformation. The emphasis moved from inner alchemy to outer fraternalism. The temple was being maintained, but the fire on the altar was dimming. This wasn't new. Throughout history, esoteric traditions have oscillated between esotericism and exotericism, between inner transformation and outer organization. The Templars, too, had once walked this line. They began as monks and warriors. But over time, as their power grew and their rituals hardened, the spiritual current that had first animated their mission became harder to access. And once they were gone, only fragments remained. The Freemasons inherited some of it, but as they became respectable, their secrets too grew ornamental. The early 20th century saw another transformation exposure. Books like The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Morals and Dogma, and later the Hiram Key and Holy Blood, Holy Grail brought Masonic and Templar mysteries into the public discourse. Suddenly what had been veiled in ritual was available in paperbacks. The thrill of the unknown faded. Conspiracy theories flourished, but deeper understanding waned. The public, having no context, mistook the map for the treasure. Symbols were misread, rites reduced to curiosities. The temple had been cracked open, and many walked in, but few knew how to build. Within Masonry, this led to schisms. Esoteric lodges tried to preserve the ancient ways, working with strict ritual discipline, studying Kabbalah alchemy, sacred geometry. But these groups were small, often isolated. The mainstream lodges, eager to maintain civic respectability, focused on philanthropy, patriotism, and fraternity. These were noble causes, but they left behind the work of transformation. The great work, the inner ladder that once promised illumination. In Europe, the rise of fascism dealt another blow. Hitler banned Freemasonry entirely, seeing it as a threat to his authoritarian vision. Masonic temples were ransacked, records seized, members imprisoned. In Spain and Italy, similar persecutions unfolded. Lodges went underground, if they survived at all. Decades of silence followed. By the time they re-emerged, the rituals were intact, but the initiatic thread had frayed. The memory had thinned, and yet even in decline, the structure remained. The architecture of initiation still stood waiting for those who could see past the performance. Even in the most rote ceremonies, traces of the original current could be found in the movements, in the silences, in the moment when the blindfold is removed and the candidate sees not just light but structure. Still, the world was changing faster than the craft could adapt. The post-war era brought television, globalization, consumerism. Attention spans shortened. Sacred silence became awkward pause. The idea of spending years moving through degrees, studying geometry, meditating on allegory, felt foreign in a world of instant information. Why climb the mountain slowly when you can Google the summit? And so the inner orders, the true core of Freemasonry, the ones that held the deepest Templar echoes, began to collapse. Not through betrayal or conspiracy, but through erosion. Through generations of initiates who received the ritual, but not the meaning. Who memorized the lines but never asked why. Who passed through the degrees without ever letting the work pass through them. This is not to say the tradition is dead. In quiet corners it endures. In lodges that still open and close with full form. In brothers who still trace the stars in their tracing boards. In whispered discussions of the word, the stone, the temple. The fire is still lit, if small, but it no longer lights the world. It flickers behind curtains. Some argue this collapse was inevitable. That all secret traditions must fade once revealed. That the Templars, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucian all were destined to leave only echoes, their truths scattered like ash from a once roaring flame. But others hold out hope. Because unlike empires, mysteries do not require armies. They require only memory. And memory once sparked can reignite the flame. In recent years, a resurgence of interest has emerged, not in fraternal masonry necessarily, but in esoteric thought. People are studying Hermeticism, Kabbalah, sacred geometry. They're asking about the old symbols again, wondering what the pyramid meant, why the eye watches, why the word was lost. And in those questions lies the potential for something more. A reawakening, a rebuilding of the inner temple, not with bricks but with awareness. But this rebuilding must be different. It cannot rely on inherited structures or blind ritual. It must be a conscious reactivation of the initiatic current, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. Because in a world increasingly fragmented, the idea of structure with soul has never been more vital. And perhaps that was always the plan. Perhaps the Templars planted a seed, knowing the tree would fall, but its fruit would remain. Perhaps the Freemasons built temples not to last forever, but to encode a pattern that future builders might rediscover, a blueprint hidden in plain sight. The collapse then is not an end. It is a return to silence, to the moment before the stone is lifted. The moment when the initiate standing before the temple gates realizes that the true door is not in stone but in the self. And somewhere in that silence the word still waits. By now the path behind you is scattered with questions. Some answered, many left hanging like veils half lifted. The Templars were burned, dissolved, scattered. The Freemasons rose in their wake, constructing not cathedrals of stone, but temples of meaning. And yet, the deeper you travel into this labyrinth of symbols and silence, the more one question looms above all others. What if anything actually survived? Not in name or costume, but in essence. Because if the Templar flame still flickers inside Freemasonry, and if Masonry itself has dimmed through the centuries, then what remains now may be less a structure than a resonance, a frequency carried in symbols, rituals, and the echo of a very old idea that knowledge once awakened cannot be entirely extinguished. That even a dying fire leaves embers. And those embers wait. What survived the fire? Let's start with the rituals. Even today, Freemasonry preserves a precise choreography of initiation, death, and rebirth. The blindfold, the knock at the door, the questions, the raising. These are not theatrics. They are coded movements meant to reenact not just ancient stories, but inner states. When a candidate is raised to the degree of Master Mason, he undergoes a symbolic death, a burial of the profane self, and a resurrection into a new identity. It echoes the Passion of Christ, the myth of Osiris, the descent of Inanna. And behind all of these, perhaps the original Templar rite, the knight not just trained but transformed. These rites survived because they were never written down. They were passed mouth to ear, hand to shoulder, step by deliberate step. When the outer world changed, the symbols within the lodge could remain intact so long as the meaning survived. And even when the meaning dimmed, the structure waited. Symbols survived too. The twin pillars, the checkerboard floor, the all-seeing eye, the unfinished pyramid. Each of these is a lens, a tool that reshapes perception. The pillars represent duality, severity, and mercy, strength, and beauty. The black and white floor represents the opposites we must reconcile. The eye watches from above, not as a threat, but as a reminder someone or something sees beyond. And the pyramid, it remains unfinished for a reason. Because the work is never done. But symbols only matter if they activate awareness. Without understanding, they become decoration. And so the survival of the symbols is only half the story. What matters more is what they activate in those who truly study them. There are also the texts, obscure, encrypted, sometimes fictional, but carrying a spark nonetheless. The Regius manuscript and the Cook manuscript in Masonry's early records. The FMA Fraternitatis of the Rosicrucians. The Constitutions of Anderson, not just a legal document, but a cosmological one structuring Masonry as a moral science guided by the great architect. Each of these survives, each a fragment of a larger half-forgotten script. But perhaps the most important survival isn't a thing at all. It is a method, a way of thinking. Call it the initiatic mindset. The belief that truth is not given but earned. That wisdom requires transformation. That reality has layers, and only by passing through stages, degrees, veils, orals can one arrive at the center. This mindset is older than the Templars. It echoes through the mystery schools of Egypt and Eleusis, through the Gnostic Gospels, through alchemy and Hermeticism. The Templars inherited it. The Freemasons preserved it. And even if the outer garments of the rites have worn thin, the method itself, to conceal, to reveal, to awaken, remains alive. And what of the more fantastic claims, the Holy Grail, the Bloodline, the Ark of the Covenant? Did these survive? The answer depends on how you define survival. If you're looking for a literal cup buried in a vault beneath Rossin, or carried by a secret line of Grail guardians, you'll likely find nothing but dust. But if you look for what the Grail represents, the vessel of transformation, the fusion of divine and human, the mystery that heals, then yes, it survived. Not in stone, but in story, in ritual, in myth that refuses to die. As for the bloodline, if such a lineage exists, it has no banner, no throne. It would have survived only by blending in, by becoming myth, then memory, then symbol. Perhaps it survives in those who feel drawn to these stories for reasons they cannot explain. In those who seek the temple, not in stone, but in themselves. And the ark, the word that was lost. In Masonic ritual, the search for the lost word is never ending. It is never recovered fully. It is whispered to be ineffable beyond speech. Some say the word is a name of God. Others say it is the self, that divine spark buried in matter. But the important thing is not whether the word was found. The important thing is that we are still searching, because that search is what survived. And perhaps that was the point all along. The Templars, if they truly carried secret wisdom, understood it could not be preserved in vaults. It had to be encoded in human behavior, in rites, in memory, in architecture, in myth. The Freemasons in their own way continued this work, not as a conspiracy, but as a conservatory of symbols, a living library. And though many of their temples now stand empty, and many of their rites are misunderstood or forgotten, the essential flame remains, small but alive. It lives in the builders of meaning, the seekers of structure, the architects of inner temples. It lives in you perhaps if you followed this far. Because to ask what survived the fire is to miss the deeper question. What was the fire for? Was it to destroy the truth or to refine it, to burn away the husk, so that only the essential could remain? If so, then what remains is not a secret order or a holy relic or a throne. What remains is a call to remember what was lost, to recover what was hidden, to build again from the ashes, from the silence, from the fire. So now we arrive at the question that has haunted every corridor of this labyrinth. Did the Knights Templar become the Freemasons? After centuries of speculation, ritual, architecture, bloodlines, and symbols, what can we say with clarity? The answer frustratingly and beautifully is this. Not in the way a tree becomes a statue, but perhaps in the way a flame becomes a lamp, not as a direct, unbroken institution, but as a transference of current of memory of a method. Let's review the evidence. First, the timing. The Templars were arrested en masse in 1307. Their leaders were tortured, and by 1312 the order was officially dissolved. Yet within a few decades, stories began to surface, not of their extinction, but of their survival. Legends abounded of Templars fleeing to Scotland, to Portugal, to Switzerland, of treasure convoys slipping out of French ports under cover of night, of knights disappearing into monastic silence, or into hidden orders that operated outside the papal gaze. Then around 1717, something curious happened in London. For lodges each meeting privately declared themselves a Grand Lodge. They called their craft Freemasonry. They claimed to be the inheritors of ancient wisdom, of sacred geometry, of builder secrets passed down since the time of Solomon. And within their rituals appeared symbols and stories strikingly similar to those associated with the Templars, the twin pillars, the holy word, the martyr's death, the lost treasure of knowledge, coincidence, or something deeper. We must look beyond documents because no official paper links the two orders. The Church and the Crown made sure of that. What we must examine instead is symbolic continuity. Templar commanderies were built using precise geometry, often with dual towers, cruciform layouts, and east-facing chapels. Freemasonic lodges continued this architectural style. Templar initiation rites were secret and shrouded in layers of silence and obedience. Freemasonry developed complex degrees, allegorical rituals, and oaths of loyalty not to a pope or king, but to the moral and metaphysical work. In the York Rite of Freemasonry, the 9th degree is literally called Knight Templar. In the Scottish Rite, degrees 30 to 33 deal with vengeance, justice, and rebuilding a lost temple, a theme uncannily similar to the Templars' pursuit of spiritual warfare and sacred restoration. Why would a stonemasons' guild preserve knightly titles? Why would they encode revenge for a martyred grandmaster in their degrees, unless perhaps they were not just building in stone, but building on memory? The name Freemason is itself intriguing. While usually interpreted to mean free stoneworker, some researchers have suggested another reading, free man of the temple, a man no longer bound by Rome or crown, but by conscience and sacred law. This theory, while speculative, matches the ethos embedded in early Masonic philosophy, a universal brotherhood moral virtue over dogma architecture as spiritual expression. Then there's the Scottish connection. Scotland, one of the few places untouched by papal arrest orders in 1307, was a haven for Templar refugees. The Sinclair family guardians of Roslin Chapel are rumored to have harbored fleeing knights. The earliest documented masonry arises here not long afterward, complete with ritual symbols and hierarchy. The Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which developed centuries later in France, claims to be based on these earlier Scottish traditions that, if the legends are true, were seeded by Templars in exile. Still, there is no linear proof, no charter signed from Jacques de Molay to the Grand Master of Masons. And perhaps there never will be. Because what links the Templars and the Freemasons is not administrative continuity, but initiatic continuity. The Templars were not just knights. They were mystics, theologians, guardians of a vision that saw the world as a spiritual battlefield. They pursued knowledge. They lived under vows of silence, poverty, and obedience. But they were also bankers, engineers, and scholars. They blended the sacred and the pragmatic. When their order fell, the idea could not be extinguished, and so it migrated into myth, into legend, into the underground. The Freemasons centuries later did not need to become the Templars to carry their flame. They only needed to inherit the work, and they did through symbol, through ritual, through architecture, and through a commitment to building not just structures but selves. Is it possible that some actual Templars survived and helped seed early Masonry? It's plausible. Scotland and Portugal, two known safe havens, both became centers of early esoteric Masonry. Some family lineages like the Sinclairs or the Banzas have long-standing rumors of secret orders and Templar rites. But even if no individual knight ever stepped into a lodge, his memory did. His fire, his vow, his architecture of meaning. And that is perhaps the deepest truth hidden in this question. Because when we ask whether the Templars became the Freemasons, we are asking whether a story became a structure, whether myth became method, whether the silence of one age became the code of the next, and all signs suggest that it did. Today, you can walk into a Masonic lodge in nearly any country in the world. You'll find symbols carved into wood, rituals passed hand-to-hand, phrases that echo the old Latin of the papal courts and the Hebrew of the temple. You'll hear about Hiram Abiff, the builder who was slain. You'll see the compass, the square, the all-seeing eye. And whether the men inside know it or not, they are walking paths carved long ago by those who once rode under the banner of the Red Cross. It may not be a bloodline. It may not be a conspiracy, but it is a legacy, and it is still building. Because the great work, the task of reconciling opposites, of building the temple within, of preserving memory through meaning, did not end with fire or exile. It continued. It transformed. It became the Masonic Lodge. It became the city plan. It became the symbol on your dollar bill. And if you're quiet enough and willing to look past the veil, you may find that the Templars never died at all. They simply changed form. They became the Freemasons, and the temple never stopped rising. So now the map is fully unrolled. The banners have been raised. The ashes sifted. The blueprints held to the light. You've walked alongside ghostly knights and silent builders, crossed borders between legend and architecture, myth and memory. And still, after nearly 3 hours of buried histories and open symbols, one thing remains unshaken. The mystery is still alive. Because that is what true mysteries do. They do not resolve. They transform. You were promised a question. Did the Templars become the Freemasons? And you've received an answer layered in stone and silence. Not directly, not officially, but perhaps fundamentally. The Templars were warriors sworn to the cross, yet suspected of heresy. They served Christ, but were accused of kissing the devil's face in secret rites. They held Jerusalem, but built their real kingdom in ideas, in codes, in commerce, in sacred geometry. When they were betrayed and broken, their symbols scattered like shards of stained glass. But symbols do not die easily. They embed themselves in architecture, in ritual, in silence. And centuries later, when the first Freemasons gathered in secret chambers with compasses and candles, they were not starting something new. They were remembering something old. The Masons did not resurrect the Templars. They became their echo. And echoes evolve. The Templars were men of sword and sanctuary. The Masons became men of lodge and law. The former held land. The latter held meaning. And yet, how little we know. Perhaps that's what makes the connection feel so eternal. We never quite reach the end of the thread. There's always another carving to decipher, another document to question, another cathedral that doesn't align with the stars by accident. The absence of proof becomes the presence of possibility. What are we left with? A trail of silence carefully measured. A ritual that reenacts a death no historian can date. A pyramid with no summit. A name, Jacques de Molay, that still appears in the initiation of modern-day Freemasons. His betrayal reenacted with whispered oaths of vengeance. This isn't nostalgia. This isn't romanticism. It's memory as architecture. Because in the end, this was never about just the Templars or just the Freemasons. It was about the shape of memory. How ideas survive when bodies burn. How meaning outlasts names. The temple was never made of stone. It was a structure of intention, of layers and levels of death and rebirth, of truths, hidden so deeply, they could only be found by those willing to be transformed in the seeking. And maybe that's the final secret, that the temple isn't something you uncover. It's something you build. Not in Scotland or France, not under Rosalind or beneath DC, but inside yourself. Because all along the Templar legacy, the treasure, the word, the path was not something buried in the earth. It was engraved into the psyche. The Templars gave us myth. The Freemasons gave us a method. But what survives is not a relic or a rite. It's the call to initiation. The quiet recognition that behind the world of appearances lies a deeper order. And the world needs builders, careful builders, inner builders, you. So the temple stands, not in one place, not under one flag, but everywhere. In symbols misunderstood, in rituals half-remembered, in buildings that mirror constellations, in cities aligned to sacred stars, in vaults that echo with forgotten prayers. In silent hands placing brick upon brick, century after century, even when no one else is watching. And in the darkened room the initiate still knocks. A voice still asks who comes here. A silence still answers one who seeks. So let it end not in conclusion but in invitation. Because if the Templars never truly died, if the Freemasons are still building, if the treasure is not gold, but meaning, then the work continues, and perhaps now it's yours to carry. The lodge doors never fully closed, the sword never fully rusted, the temple never fully crumbled. The mystery remains.